Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Shadow Script, and tonight, we open doors that were never meant to be unlocked. These aren't ordinary stories, these are haunted echoes from cursed homes, each soaked in shadows, soaked in rain, and dripping with dread. As the storm pounds outside your window, remember, some houses breathe even when no one lives inside, and some walls remember everything. So grab your headphones, turn off every light, and let the rain pull you deeper into the silence. Because these are haunted house horror stories with rain sound, and once you enter, the house might not let you leave. Now let's begin. Our first story is titled, Whispers from the Cellar, written by Amelia Gravehart. The autumn wind howled through the bare branches of the oak trees surrounding the Victorian house on Maple Street in Salem, Massachusetts. Rebecca pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders as she stood beside the rusty iron gate, staring up at the towering structure that would be their new home. The house loomed against the gray October sky, its darkened windows like hollow eyes watching their every move. "Are you sure about this place, David?" she asked her husband, who was already unloading boxes from their rental truck. The three-story mansion had been vacant for over a decade, and the real estate agent had been surprisingly eager to close the deal at a price that seemed too good to be true. David wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool air. "Come on, Rebecca. Look at this place. It's a steal. We'll never find another house like this in our price range in Boston." The house had been built in 1847 by a wealthy textile merchant named Cornelius Blackwood, according to the local historical society. The Blackwood family had lived there for 3 generations before the last surviving member, old Martha Blackwood, had died alone in 1987. Since then, it had changed hands several times, but no family had ever stayed longer than a year. As they carried their belongings up the creaking front steps, Rebecca noticed the intricate woodwork around the door frame was carved with strange symbols she didn't recognize. The heavy oak door groaned on its hinges as David pushed it open, revealing a grand foyer with a sweeping staircase. They spent the rest of the day unpacking, focusing on the essentials, their bedroom on the second floor, kitchen, and David's makeshift office. The house had electricity and running water, though both seemed to work sporadically. The heating system was an ancient radiator system that clanked and hissed throughout the night. It was on their 3rd night in the house that Rebecca first heard the whispers. She had been lying in bed, listening to David's steady breathing beside her, when a faint murmuring sound drifted up from somewhere below. At first, she thought it might be the old pipes, but as she strained to listen, the sounds became more distinct. Voices, multiple voices, speaking in hushed tones. Rebecca slipped out of bed and padded barefoot to the bedroom door. The whispers seemed to be coming from the ground floor, somewhere near the kitchen. She descended the stairs slowly, each step producing a soft creak. The whispers grew clearer as she reached the first floor, but she still couldn't make out the words. The cellar. Rebecca had noticed the cellar door on their first day in the house. It was located in a small alcove off the kitchen, secured with an old-fashioned iron lock. Standing in the kitchen now, with only pale moonlight for illumination, Rebecca pressed her ear against the cellar door. The whispers were definitely coming from below. "David," she called softly. The whispers stopped abruptly. Rebecca held her breath, her heart pounding. After several long minutes of silence, she heard David's voice from upstairs. "Rebecca, what are you doing down there?" As she turned away from the cellar door, she could have sworn she heard her own voice whisper back, "Rebecca, what are you doing down there?" The next morning, Rebecca told David about the whispers, but he dismissed her concerns with a laugh. "Old houses make all kinds of strange noises," he said. "The foundation is probably settling, or there might be animals in the basement." It wasn't animals, David. It was voices, human voices. David reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're still adjusting to the new place. Why don't we check out the cellar this weekend?" But that night, the whispers returned. This time, Rebecca was ready. She had placed a small digital recorder on the nightstand, and when the faint murmuring began around midnight, she pressed record and crept downstairs. The whispers were louder tonight, more insistent. As Rebecca approached the cellar door, she could almost make out individual words. She held the recorder close to the door, letting it capture whatever was happening in the basement. The whispers continued for nearly an hour before gradually fading away. The next morning, Rebecca played the recording for David over breakfast. At first, there was only the sound of her footsteps and the house creaking. But then, faintly, the whispers could be heard. David frowned, adjusting the volume. That's weird, but it could be anything. Radio interference, maybe. David, we don't have any neighbors within half a mile. And listen to this part. Rebecca fast-forwarded to a section near the end. The whispers were clearer here, and though the words were still indistinct, the rhythm and cadence were unmistakably human. Okay, David admitted. That is strange. Let's check out the cellar tonight. They spent the afternoon searching for the key to the cellar lock. Rebecca found it eventually, tucked away in a small drawer in the kitchen hutch. The key was made of black iron, ornately decorated with the same strange symbols they had noticed around the front door. As evening approached, David gathered his tools: a flashlight, a crowbar in case the lock was rusted shut, and his smartphone. Rebecca armed herself with a second flashlight and her own phone, though her hands were shaking. The lock turned easily, despite its age. The cellar door swung open with a prolonged groan, revealing stone steps that descended into absolute darkness. The smell that wafted up from below was musty and old, with an underlying odor that reminded Rebecca of something organic and decaying. "Here we go," David said, shining his flashlight down the stairs. "Stay close." The stone steps were worn smooth by decades of use, and Rebecca had to grip the rough-hewn handrail to keep from slipping. The temperature dropped noticeably as they descended, and their breath began to mist in the cold air. The basement was larger than Rebecca had expected, extending beneath most of the house. The walls were made of gray stone, and the floor was packed earth that felt damp beneath their feet. Wooden support beams crossed the ceiling at regular intervals, draped with cobwebs that sparkled in the flashlight beams. "Well, no obvious signs of animals," David said, sweeping his light across the space. "Though I can see why you might have heard something. Sound probably carries easily through these old floorboards." Rebecca wasn't convinced. The basement felt wrong somehow, as if they were intruding on a space that was meant to remain undisturbed. The shadows seemed to shift and move just beyond the reach of their flashlights. They were about to leave when David's flashlight beam caught something in the far corner. "What's that over there?" They picked their way across the uneven floor. In the corner, partially hidden behind one of the support beams, was an old wooden cabinet. It was about 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide, with elaborate carvings on its doors that matched the symbols they had seen elsewhere in the house. "Should we open it?" Rebecca asked, though every instinct was screaming at her to leave the basement immediately. David reached for the cabinet doors. They opened with a soft click, revealing the interior filled with old books. Their leather bindings were cracked and faded with age, but these weren't ordinary books. The titles were written in languages Rebecca didn't recognize, and many appeared to be handwritten rather than printed. David pulled out one of the books and opened it carefully. The pages were covered with dense text and spidery handwriting, interspersed with detailed illustrations that made Rebecca's stomach turn. The drawings depicted human figures in various states of anguish, surrounded by geometric patterns and symbols. "This looks like some kind of occult library," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "These books must be incredibly old." Rebecca wanted to tell him to put the book back, to close the cabinet, and never return to the basement. But before she could speak, a new sound filled the cellar. Whispers. The voices seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, a chorus of murmured words that echoed from every direction. Rebecca grabbed David's arm, her fingernails digging into his jacket. "We need to leave. Now." But David was still examining the book, seemingly oblivious to the growing cacophony around them. "This is incredible, Rebecca. Do you realize what we've found?" The whispers were getting louder, more insistent. Rebecca could almost make out words now, though they seemed to be in the same archaic language as the books. The temperature in the basement was dropping rapidly. "David, please. Something's wrong down here." Finally, her husband looked up from the book. His face was pale in the flashlight beam, and his eyes had a strange, distant look. "Can you hear them, Rebecca? They're calling to us." The whispers suddenly shifted, becoming clearer and more distinct. To Rebecca's horror, she realized the voices were now speaking in English. "Rebecca," they whispered in unison. Her own voice echoed back at her from a dozen different sources. "Rebecca, come closer." She stumbled backward, nearly tripping. The voices followed her, calling her name over and over again in her own voice. But it wasn't just her voice. She could hear David's voice too, pleading with her to stay. "David, we have to go. Something is very wrong here." But when she turned around, David was gone. Rebecca spun in a circle, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "David, David, where are you?" His voice came from somewhere behind her, near the cabinet. "I'm right here, Rebecca. Come look at this." She followed the sound of his voice, but when her flashlight found the cabinet, it was empty. David was nowhere to be seen. "David, this isn't funny. Where are you?" "I'm here," his voice said, but now it seemed to be coming from above her, from the floorboards of the kitchen. "Come upstairs, Rebecca." Rebecca didn't believe it was really David speaking. The voice was his, but there was something wrong with it, something hollow and artificial. She began backing toward the stairs, keeping her flashlight trained on the shadows. The whispers were everywhere now, cacophony of voices coming from walls, the floor, the ceiling. She could hear her own voice and David's voice mixed in with dozens of others, all calling to her, all trying to convince her to stay. "Rebecca, don't leave us." Her own voice pleaded from the darkness. "We've been waiting so long for someone to find us." She reached the stairs and began climbing, taking them two at a time. The whispers followed her, growing more desperate and angry as she ascended. By the time she reached the kitchen, they had become screams. Rebecca slammed the cellar door shut and turned the key, then dragged a heavy chair from the dining room and wedged it under the door handle. The screaming from below gradually faded, but she could still hear faint scratching sounds. "David," she called out, her voice shaking. "David, are you up here?" There was no answer. Rebecca searched the entire house, calling her husband's name, but he was nowhere to be found. His car was still in the driveway, and his wallet and keys were on the nightstand. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. She called the police, but they were skeptical of her story. How could a grown man simply disappear from a locked basement with only one exit? The officers searched the house thoroughly, including the cellar, but found no trace of David. The old books Rebecca described were gone, and the cabinet was empty except for dust and spider webs. The lead detective, Lieutenant Morrison, sat with Rebecca in the kitchen as the search concluded. "Mrs. Chun, I have to ask, had you and your husband been having any marital problems?" Rebecca shook her head. "We were happy. We just bought this house together." Lieutenant Morrison looked around the kitchen with obvious unease. "This house has a history, you know. We've had several missing persons reports over the years, all connected to this address. The previous owners reported their teenage son missing in 2019. Before that, it was an elderly man named William Foster in 2015. She trailed off, but Rebecca understood. "How many people have disappeared from this house?" "7 that we know of. Maybe more. The reports go back to the 1950s. Rebecca spent that night at a hotel in town, but she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the whispers calling her name. She knew she had to go back to the house, not to live there, but to try to find David. The next morning, Rebecca returned to the house with supplies, industrial-strength flashlights, a digital camera, a voice recorder, and a crowbar. She also brought a small silver cross that had belonged to her grandmother. The cellar door was still locked, the chair still wedged beneath the handle. But as Rebecca approached, she could hear the whispers starting up again, faint at first, but growing stronger. This time, they weren't calling her name. They were having a conversation. "She's back," one voice said. It sounded like David. I knew she would come, another voice replied. This one sounded like Rebecca herself. Bring her down, a third voice added. This one was older, unfamiliar. Rebecca removed the chair and unlocked the door. The whispers immediately grew louder, more excited. She could hear David's voice among them, pleading with her to come downstairs. Rebecca, please. I need your help. They won't let me leave. It sounded so much like her husband that for a moment, Rebecca almost believed it was really him. But she had heard these same voices mimicking them before. She descended the stairs slowly, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The basement looked the same as it had the night before, except that the cabinet in the corner was now open again. The books had returned, lined up neatly on the shelves. David, she called out, are you down here? I'm here, his voice responded from somewhere near the cabinet. I'm trapped, Rebecca. They won't let me go. Rebecca approached the cabinet cautiously, her flashlight trained on the shadows around it. As she got closer, she could see something that made her blood run cold. There was another book on the top shelf, one that hadn't been there before. It was bound in leather that looked disturbingly fresh, and when Rebecca shone her light on the cover, she could make out a name embossed in gold lettering, David Chun. With trembling hands, she reached for the book and opened it. The pages were filled with text in David's own handwriting, but the words made no sense. They seemed to be some kind of ritual or incantation, written over and over again, increasingly erratic script. On the final page, there was a single sentence written in fresh ink. She came back for me. Rebecca dropped the book and stumbled backward. The whispers around her were getting louder, more insistent. She could hear David's voice, but also her own voice, and dozens of others. Join us, they whispered in unison. Join us and be together forever. Rebecca turned and ran for the stairs, but something was wrong. The stone steps seemed to stretch on forever, as if the distance to the kitchen door was growing with each step she took. Behind her, the whispers had become a roar. She stumbled and fell, her flashlight clattering across the stone floor and going out. In the absolute darkness, the voices seemed to come from everywhere at once. She could feel hands reaching for her, cold fingers grasping at her clothes and hair. Rebecca pulled out her grandmother's silver cross and held it in front of her like a shield. Leave me alone, she screamed. I won't join you. The hands recoiled as if burned, and for a moment, the whispers ceased. In the sudden silence, Rebecca heard a new voice, David's voice, but different somehow. Clearer, more real. Rebecca, run. Get out of the house. Don't come back. She didn't need to be told twice. Rebecca scrambled to her feet and felt her way up the stairs in the darkness, guided only by the faint light coming from the open cellar door. When she reached the kitchen, she slammed the door shut and locked it, then ran from the house without looking back. 3 days later, Rebecca returned with a moving truck and a team of movers. She had decided to abandon the house entirely, to take what belongings she could and never return. But as the movers carried boxes out to the truck, Rebecca heard something that stopped her cold. One of the men, a burly guy named Pete, was carrying a box from the kitchen when he paused near the cellar door. Hey lady, he called to Rebecca. There's someone down in your basement calling for help. Rebecca's blood turned to ice. What? Yeah, sounds like a guy. He's calling your name. Says he needs help getting out. The other movers had stopped their work and were listening now. Sure enough, David's voice could be heard coming from behind the locked cellar door, clear as day. Rebecca? Rebecca, I'm trapped down here. Please help me. I found a way out, but I need you to open the door. Pete reached for the door handle. Don't worry, buddy. We'll get you out of there. No. Rebecca lunged forward and grabbed Pete's arm. Don't open that door. It's not him. Pete stared at her as if she had lost her mind. Lady, there's someone trapped in your basement. We can't just leave him down there. The other movers were nodding in agreement, but Rebecca shook her head frantically. It's not real. It's not my husband. Please, just trust me on this. David's voice came again, more desperate now. Rebecca, please. I'm hurt. I think my leg is broken. I just need you to open the door. The voice was so convincing, so perfectly David, that for a moment Rebecca wavered. What if she was wrong? What if David really was trapped down there? But then she remembered the book with his name on it, the pages filled with his handwriting, but containing words he would never write. Whatever was behind that door, it wasn't her husband. "We're leaving," she told the movers. "Now, take what you can carry and let's go." Pete protested, but Rebecca had already started walking toward the moving truck. "I'll call the police when we get to town," she said. "If there's really someone down there, they can handle it." As they drove away from the house, Rebecca could see Pete looking back through the truck's rear window. She knew he thought she was crazy, abandoning her husband to die in a basement. But Rebecca also knew that David was already gone, claimed by whatever ancient evil lived in that cellar. The house on Maple Street stood empty once again, its windows dark and its secrets intact. The for sale sign went up a week later, but Rebecca knew no one would ever stay there long. Sometimes, late at night in her new apartment in Portland, Rebecca would wake to the sound of whispers. They were faint, almost inaudible, but she knew they were calling her name. The voices followed her wherever she went, a constant reminder of what she had lost and what still waited for her in that basement. She never answered them. She never went back to Salem, but she knew that someday the whispers would grow loud enough that she wouldn't have a choice. The house was patient. It could wait. After all, it had already collected David. Rebecca would be next. The last entry in David's journal, found years later when the house was finally demolished, contained only one line written over and over again in an increasingly shaky handwriting. The whispers never stop. The whispers never stop. The whispers never stop. And in the margin, in Rebecca's own handwriting, though she had no memory of writing it, "I'm coming home." The moving truck disappeared around the bend of Thornfield Lane, leaving Margot Harrison standing alone before the towering Victorian manor she had inherited from her great-aunt. The estate agent had called it remarkable opportunity and authentic period charm. But as evening shadows crept across the weathered stone facade, Margot felt only a creeping sense of unease. Ravens Hollow Manor had stood empty for 37 years. The key turned with surprising ease, as if the house itself was eager to welcome her inside. The entrance hall stretched before her, its once grand staircase now carpeted in dust and neglect. Wallpaper peeled in long strips from the walls, revealing patches of yellowed plaster beneath. The air hung thick with the musty scent of abandonment and something else, something metallic and unpleasant that made her nose wrinkle. First things first, Margot muttered to herself, pulling out her phone to call the renovation crew. She had already arranged for them to begin work the following Monday. The manor needed everything: new plumbing, electrical work, and complete redecoration. But it had good bones, as her late great-aunt Cordelia used to say. The next few days passed in a blur of contractors, delivery trucks, and endless decision-making. Margot had taken temporary residence in a small guest cottage on the property, while the main house underwent its transformation. She watched from her window each morning as workers stripped away decades of decay, revealing the elegant architecture beneath. By Thursday, the renovation crew had made remarkable progress. The structural work was complete. New wallpaper had been hung throughout the first floor, and the rooms were beginning to resemble their former grandeur. Margot decided to spend that evening in the manor, sleeping in the newly renovated master bedroom to get a feel for her new home. She prepared a simple dinner in the updated kitchen and settled into the sitting room with a book. The new wallpaper was stunning, deep burgundy with an intricate damask pattern that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. Everything smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. At 11:47 p.m., Margot climbed the stairs to the master bedroom. The wallpaper here was a subtle cream color with delicate rose motifs. She had chosen it specifically for its calming effect, hoping it would help her sleep better in the unfamiliar surroundings. She fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the long day. The grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime midnight. Margot stirred, half awakening to a sound she couldn't quite identify, a soft, rhythmic dripping, like a leaky faucet. She opened her eyes and froze. The wallpaper was bleeding. Dark red stains were seeping through the cream-colored paper, spreading across the delicate rose pattern like spilled wine. But this wasn't wine. The metallic scent she had noticed on her first day filled the room, stronger now and nauseating. Margot scrambled for the bedside lamp, her hands shaking. In the yellow light, the stains looked even more horrific, deep crimson patches that seemed to pulse and grow as she watched. The liquid wasn't just staining the wallpaper. It was actively bleeding through, forming rivulets that ran down to pool on the newly installed baseboards. She grabbed her phone and called the renovation foreman, Marcus Webb. "There's something wrong with the wallpaper," she gasped when he answered, clearly having woken him. "It's bleeding. There's blood coming through the walls." "Ma'am, that's impossible. We just hung that paper yesterday. Maybe it's a water leak from the floor above. Sometimes rusty pipes can." "It's not rust, Marcus. It's blood. I know what blood looks like." There was a long pause. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. By the time Marcus arrived with 2 of his crew members, the bleeding had stopped. The wallpaper showed only faint brown stains, like old water damage, in the harsh light of their work lamps. It looked almost innocuous. "See here," Marcus said, running his hand along the wall. "The paper's slightly damp, but there's no active leak. Probably just settling moisture from the renovation work. Old houses do this sometimes. The new wallpaper pulls moisture from the plaster, and if there are any old stains underneath." Margot wanted to believe him, but she knew what she had seen. The stains had been red, not brown. Fresh, not old. Marcus and his crew left after thorough inspection, promising to return in the morning to investigate further. Margot spent the rest of the night in the guest cottage, unable to shake the image of blood seeping through her bedroom walls. The next evening, despite her fears, curiosity drove her back to the manor. She positioned herself in the sitting room with a clear view of the main staircase and waited. At 11:55 p.m., she crept upstairs and positioned herself outside the master bedroom door. At exactly midnight, it began again. This time, she forced herself to watch. The stains appeared first as small spots, dark and wet. They spread slowly across the wallpaper, taking on definite shapes. Not random patches, but deliberate patterns. Letters. Her blood ran cold as she realized what she was seeing. Words were forming in the bleeding wallpaper, written in crimson liquid that dripped and ran but somehow remained legible. "Help me." The message lingered for several minutes before fading to brown and then disappearing entirely. Margot stood in the doorway, trembling, until the clock finished chiming the hour. She called her friend Catherine the next morning. "You have to come see this," Margot pleaded. "I'm not losing my mind. The house is trying to tell me something." Catherine arrived that evening with her husband David, both skeptical but concerned for their friend's well-being. They positioned themselves in the bedroom at 11:45 p.m., armed with cameras and a digital recorder. At midnight, the bleeding began again. Catherine's scream echoed through the room as the dark stains spread across the wall. This time, the message was longer. "Murdered here. Find my body. Under the roses. Jesus Christ," David whispered, his camera clicking frantically. "Are you getting this?" The words remained visible for nearly 10 minutes before fading away. When they reviewed the photographs later, however, they showed only blank wallpaper. The digital recorder had captured nothing but the sound of the grandfather clock chiming midnight. "The camera isn't picking it up," Catherine said, her voice shaking. "But we all saw it. We all saw the same thing." Margot spent the next morning researching the history of Ravens Hollow Manor. What she discovered in the local historical society archives made her stomach turn. In 1987, a young woman named Vivian Cross had worked as a housekeeper for Margot's great-aunt Cordelia. According to newspaper reports, Vivian had simply disappeared one day, leaving behind only a note saying she was returning to her family in Scotland. No one had questioned it at the time. Domestic workers often left without much notice. But there had been rumors. The newspaper clippings mentioned whispered speculation about Vivian's relationship with a local married man, jealous confrontations, and unexplained screams heard from the manor on the night she disappeared. The police had investigated briefly, but found no evidence of foul play. Cordelia Harrison had been above suspicion, a pillar of the community and a generous benefactor to local charities. The manor had been closed shortly after Vivian's disappearance. Cordelia had moved to the cottage, claiming the large house had become too much to manage. She lived as a recluse until her death the previous year, rarely speaking to neighbors and never allowing visitors into the main house. That evening, Margot stood in the garden behind the manor, staring at the rose garden that had once been Cordelia's pride and joy. 37 years of neglect had turned it into a wild tangle of thorns and overgrowth, but beneath the chaos, she could still see the original formal layout. At midnight, she was back in the master bedroom. The bleeding began as usual, but tonight the message was different. Cordelia killed me, jealous of her nephew. I loved the wrong man, buried beneath the red roses. The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. Cordelia's nephew, James, had been married but known for his affairs. Vivian must have become involved with him, and Cordelia, protective of her family's reputation and perhaps harboring her own feelings for the young man, had taken deadly action. The next morning, Margot called the police. Detective Inspector Robert Mills was skeptical until Margot showed him the historical records and explained the pattern of the midnight bleeding. He agreed to obtain a search warrant for the garden, if only to put her mind at ease. The excavation began on a gray Tuesday morning. 2 constables with ground-penetrating radar located an anomaly beneath the overgrown rose bed, exactly where the wallpaper had indicated. By afternoon, they had uncovered the skeletal remains of a young woman, along with fragments of a dress and a locket engraved with the initials VC. The coroner confirmed that the remains belonged to Vivian Cross. The position of the bones and damage to the skull suggested she had been struck from behind with a heavy object, possibly a fireplace poker that had gone missing from the manor around the time of her disappearance. That night, Margot waited in the master bedroom once more. At midnight, the wallpaper began to bleed, but the message was different. "Thank you. Rest now. Peace." The words faded slowly, and then the bleeding stopped. It never returned. Vivian Cross was given a proper burial in the local cemetery. The scandal made headlines throughout the region. The respected Cordelia Harrison revealed as a murderer, her victim finally receiving justice after nearly 4 decades. Margot completed the renovation of Ravens Hollow Manor and decided to stay. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a great burden had been lifted. She converted one of the upstairs rooms into a memorial for Vivian, displaying the few personal effects that had been recovered and a photograph from the newspaper archives showing a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Margot thought she caught the scent of roses drifting through the halls, not the cloying fragrance of death and decay, but the sweet, clean smell of flowers in bloom. She liked to think it was Vivian's way of saying that she was finally at peace. The wallpaper never bled again, but Margot kept the cream paper with its delicate rose pattern exactly as it was. It seemed only fitting that the room which had witnessed such horror should also serve as a testament to the power of truth and the persistence of justice, even beyond death. The manor stood solid and welcoming on Thornfield Lane, its windows glowing warmly in the evening light. It was no longer a house of secrets and hidden sins, but a home where the past had been honored and the dead could rest in peace. And every night at midnight, when the grandfather clock chimed the hour, there was only silence, the blessed, peaceful silence of a soul finally free. The autumn wind rattled the windows of the old Victorian house in Manchester as 17-year-old Marcus sat hunched over his calculus homework. 3 months had passed since Lily vanished without a trace, and the weight of her absence pressed down on the family like a suffocating blanket. The police had called off the active search 2 weeks ago, citing lack of evidence and leads gone cold. Marcus tried to focus on the equations before him, but the scratching sounds from above made concentration impossible. His parents, David and Catherine, insisted it was just mice or settling wood, but Marcus knew better. The sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic. They came in patterns of 3, always at night, always when the house fell silent. "Marcus, come find me," He dropped his pencil, the graphite tip snapping against his notebook. There it was again, Lily's voice, clear as spring water, drifting down through the ceiling. His heart hammered against his ribs as he tilted his head upward, listening. "I'm waiting for you, brother." The voice was undeniably hers, carrying that slight lisp she'd had since childhood when she got excited. But it couldn't be real. Lily had been missing for 93 days. The rational part of his mind, the part that excelled in advanced physics and chemistry, insisted he was experiencing auditory hallucinations brought on by grief and guilt. But the guilty part of his mind, the part that replayed their last argument over and over, whispered something else entirely. Marcus had been the last person to see Lily alive. They'd fought about something stupid, her borrowing his gaming headset without asking. He'd called her a brat, told her to stay out of his room. She'd stormed off, her long auburn hair whipping behind her as she climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor. That was the last time anyone saw his 13-year-old sister. The scratching resumed above his head. 3 deliberate scrapes, followed by a pause. Then 3 more. Marcus pushed back from his desk and crept to his bedroom door. The hallway stretched before him, dimly lit by the antique sconces their mother had insisted on installing. The pull-down ladder to the attic hung at the far end, its brass chain swaying slightly despite the absence of any breeze. "Mom, Dad," he called softly, but received no response. They'd gone to bed hours ago, exhausted from another day of fielding calls from well-meaning neighbors and avoiding the pitying glances of strangers at the grocery store. 3 more scratches echoed from above. Marcus grabbed a flashlight from the hall closet and approached the attic access. The chain felt ice-cold against his palm as he pulled it down. The wooden ladder unfolded with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire house. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight as he aimed it up into the darkness. "Lily," he whispered, "are you up there?" The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus tested the first rung with his weight. The old ladder held firm, though it creaked ominously. He'd only been in the attic a handful of times in his life, usually to help his father retrieve Christmas decorations or store away outgrown furniture. The space was cramped and filled with the accumulated detritus of 17 years of family life. As he climbed, the musty smell of old wood and forgotten memories grew stronger. His flashlight beam swept across cardboard boxes labeled in his mother's neat handwriting. Baby clothes, school projects, photo albums 1995 to 2000. A thick layer of dust covered everything, undisturbed except for Marcus's breath caught in his throat. There, in the dust near the far corner of the attic, were footprints, small ones, the size Lily would make. "I knew you'd come." The voice came from directly behind him. Marcus spun around so quickly he nearly lost his balance on the ladder. His flashlight beam swept across empty air, but he could have sworn he felt breath against the back of his neck. "Lily, where are you?" His voice cracked like it hadn't since he was 14. A soft giggle echoed from somewhere in the darkness beyond his flashlight's reach. It was Lily's laugh, the one she made when she was about to reveal a secret or show him something she'd discovered. Marcus hauled himself fully into the attic, his head brushing against the sloped ceiling. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he followed the trail of footprints deeper into the shadows. They led past towers of storage boxes, around his father's old golf clubs, and toward a section of the attic he'd never explored. Getting warmer, Lily's voice sang from the darkness ahead. The footprints ended at a large, ornate trunk pushed against the far wall. It was old, much older than anything else in their family's collection. The brass corners were green with age, and the leather straps were cracked and brittle. Marcus had never seen it before, which was odd considering how meticulously his parents cataloged their possessions. "Open it, Marcus. See what I found." His hands trembled as he reached for the trunk's latch. The metal was so cold it burned his fingertips. The lid was heavier than expected, requiring both hands to lift. The hinges shrieked in protest, a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard that made Marcus's teeth ache. Inside, nestled in rotting velvet lining, were hundreds of photographs. Not family photos, but strange, unsettling images that made Marcus's stomach turn. They showed the attic as it was now, but also as it had been decades ago. In some photos, he could make out figures moving in the shadows, indistinct shapes that might have been people but seemed wrong somehow. Too tall or too thin, or bent at impossible angles. At the bottom of the pile was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. Marcus opened it carefully, afraid the brittle paper might crumble at his touch. The entries were written in multiple hands, spanning decades. The earliest dated back to 1943. The voices started 3 days after we moved in. Read one entry. Little Margaret says she hears children playing in the walls. She wants to join them. Another, dated 1967. Found Tommy in the attic this morning, talking to empty air. He insists his sister Jenny is there, but Jenny died of pneumonia last winter. The cold spot near the trunk is getting larger. And another from 1989. The Peterson boy has been missing for 2 weeks. Police think he ran away. I saw him yesterday, walking across the attic floor. He didn't respond when I called his name. His feet made no sound. Marcus's hand shook as he read entry after entry, each telling a similar story. Children drawn to the attic. Children who heard voices. Children who disappeared. Now you understand. This time, Lily's voice came from directly beside him. Marcus turned slowly, afraid of what he might see. There was nothing there, but the temperature had dropped so suddenly that his breath came out in visible puffs. Understand what? He managed to whisper. Why we can't leave. Why we stay here, in the space between spaces. It's not just an attic, Marcus. It's a doorway. And once you hear the voices, once you answer them, the door opens. The photographs in the trunk began to flutter, though there was no wind. Marcus watched in horror as the images changed before his eyes. Now they showed him, sitting in the attic with the journal in his hands. In the background, barely visible in the shadows, stood a group of children. Their faces were pale and indistinct, but Marcus could make out their modern clothing spanning different decades. And there among them was Lily. Her auburn hair hung limp around her shoulders, and her eyes were black holes in her pale face. She was smiling, but it wasn't the warm smile Marcus remembered. This smile was cold, hungry. The door opened for me 3 months ago. Lily's voice continued, seeming to come from everywhere at once. I heard them calling, just like you're hearing me now. I thought I was so clever, sneaking up here after our fight. I thought I'd found the perfect hiding spot where you'd never find me. Marcus tried to back away, but found he couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, and the air around him had grown thick as honey. But this isn't hiding, is it, Lily? He managed to say. You're trapped. We prefer to think of it as collecting. Each generation of this house, we collect one, sometimes more, if they're particularly sensitive to our call. You've always been sensitive, Marcus. Remember when you were little? You talked to imaginary friends all the time. Mom and Dad thought it was cute. Memories flooded back, childhood companions that only he could see, voices in empty rooms, shadows that moved independently of their sources. His parents had indeed thought it was adorable, a sign of a creative mind. They'd never realized he was actually communicating with something. The thing about doors, Lily continued, her voice growing stronger, more present, is that they swing both ways. We can call to you, but we need you to open them from your side. We need you to choose to join us. The trunk began to glow with a pale, sickly light. Inside, beneath the photographs and journal, Marcus could see another layer. Clothing. Children's clothing from different eras. A sailor suit from the 1940s. A poodle skirt from the 1950s. Bell-bottom jeans from the 1970s. And there, folded neatly at the top, was the sweater Lily had been wearing the day she disappeared. You don't have to be afraid anymore, she said. No more guilt about our fight. No more wondering what happened to me. You can join us, and we can be together forever. Isn't that what you wanted when you used to promise to always protect me? Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. The guilt he'd carried for 3 months felt like a physical weight on his chest. He had promised to protect her. He'd failed spectacularly, and the last words between them had been angry ones. But something in his analytical mind, the part that had always served him well in science classes, began to rebel against the supernatural explanation. If this was really Lily, why did she seem so different? Why did her voice carry undertones of hunger and malice that had never been there before? "Prove it," he said suddenly. "Prove you're really Lily." The silence that followed stretched for long seconds. When Lily's voice returned, it carried a note of uncertainty. "What do you mean? I'm your sister. What did you call our cat when you were 6? Another pause. "We had a cat." "What song did I sing to you when you had nightmares?" "Marcus, why are you asking these?" "What was the last thing I taught you before you disappeared?" The temperature in the attic plummeted. The glow from the trunk flickered and dimmed. When Lily's voice returned, it was different, layered, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "We are Lily. We are all of them. We remember what she remembered, feel what she felt, her love for you, her trust in you. We can be her better than she ever was." Marcus felt a cold hand brush against his cheek, and for a moment, he saw her clearly. Not Lily, but a composite creature wearing her face like a mask. Behind it, dozens of other children's faces flickered in and out of view, all of them pale, all of them hungry, all of them reaching for him with grasping fingers. "The door is open, Marcus. Don't you want to step through? Don't you want to stop the pain?" For a moment, the temptation was overwhelming. The idea of no more grief, no more guilt, no more nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering what he could have done differently. The promise of being reunited with his sister, even if this twisted version wasn't really her. But then Marcus remembered something else. The last thing he taught Lily before she disappeared hadn't been about homework or chores. It had been about their family's escape plan in case of fire. Always go down, never up. Heat rises, smoke rises. The attic is a trap. "You're not Lily," he said firmly, standing up despite the pressure trying to keep him kneeling. "Lily would never try to trap me. She would want me to escape." The creatures wearing his sister's face snarled, and suddenly the attic was full of movement. Shadows peeled away from the walls, revealing the true forms of the trapped children. They were wrong, stretched and distorted by whatever force had claimed them. Their eyes were holes, their mouths too wide, their fingers too long. "Then you'll join us by force," they said in unison, their voice no longer carrying any trace of Lily's warmth. Marcus clutched the journal to his chest and ran for the ladder. Behind him, he could hear the creatures giving chase, their footsteps like spiders skittering across the floor. Cold fingers grabbed his jacket, his hair, trying to pull him back into the darkness. He half fell down the ladder, dropping the journal in his haste. It hit the hallway floor and sprang open, its pages scattering. As Marcus scrambled to gather them up, one entry caught his eye. It was written in red ink that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "The only way to close the door is to seal it from both sides. Someone must remain behind to hold it shut. The sacrifice must be willing, and it must be someone the door has already marked. Once sealed, the door cannot be opened again from either side." Above him, the attic access began to rattle violently. Dust rained down as something heavy threw itself against the closed hatch. Marcus understood now why the families had always left after losing a child. They hadn't been running from grief. They'd been running from the door before it could claim anyone else. But running wasn't a solution. The door would remain, waiting for the next family, the next sensitive child, to hear the voices. His phone buzzed with a text message. For a wild moment, he thought it might be from Lily's number, but it was just a reminder about a physics test on Monday. The mundane normalcy of it made him laugh, a sound that bordered on hysteria. He looked up at the rattling hatch, then down at the scattered journal pages. Somewhere in that darkness above, the real Lily might still exist, trapped and suffering while creatures wore her face. Even if she was gone, truly gone, other children would be drawn here in the future, unless someone closed the door permanently. The banging from above grew more violent. Plaster began to rain down from the ceiling as something threw itself repeatedly against the hatch. Soon it would break through. Marcus gathered up the journal pages and walked back to the ladder. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, his body fighting against what his mind had decided. The rational part of him screamed that this was insane, that there had to be another solution, that 17-year-olds didn't sacrifice themselves to save strangers. But the part of him that had always promised to protect his sister, the part that had failed her once before, knew what he had to do. He climbed back up into the attic. The creatures were waiting for him, arranged in a circle around the glowing trunk. They wore the faces of children from across the decades, but their true nature showed through. Hungry, desperate things that fed on innocence and love. The thing wearing Lily's face stood at the center, still beautiful, still heartbreaking. "You came back," it said with Lily's voice. "I knew you would. You always kept your promises to me." "I'm keeping one now," Marcus said, pulling the journal pages from his pocket. "I promise to protect you. That means protecting you from becoming like them." He began reading from the ritual described in the final entries. The words felt heavy on his tongue, each syllable seeming to resonate through the floorboards and into the bones of the house itself. As he spoke, the creatures began to shriek, their forms becoming less solid, more transparent. "What are you doing?" the Lily thing demanded, its voice losing its human qualities and becoming something between a whistle and a roar. "Closing the door," Marcus said, from both sides. The trunk's glow intensified, becoming painful to look at directly. The photographs inside began to burn, decades of trapped moments turning to ash. As each image was consumed, one of the creatures faded away, their anguished cries echoing through dimensions. Marcus felt something tugging at his soul, a pulling sensation that started in his chest and spread outward. This was the price of closing the door. Someone had to remain behind to hold it shut from the inside. Someone who had been marked by the entities, but still retained their humanity. The last image to burn showed Lily as she really was, terrified and alone, but still fighting against the things that had taken her. As it caught fire, Marcus saw her true form separate from the creature that had been wearing her face. For just a moment, his real sister stood before him, transparent but recognizably herself. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with relief and love. "Take care of Mom and Dad. Tell them I love them, and I'm sorry about the fight." Then she was gone, truly gone this time, released to whatever waited beyond. Marcus felt the door closing around him, reality folding in on itself. The attic began to fade, becoming a space between spaces, a pocket dimension sealed away from the world of the living. He would remain here, holding the door shut, ensuring that no more children would be drawn into this trap. It wasn't the ending he'd planned for his life, but as the world dissolved around him, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 months' peace. He had finally kept his promise to protect his sister. The next morning, David and Catherine woke to find Marcus's bedroom empty, his homework still spread across his desk. The only sign of disturbance was the pull-down ladder to the attic, hanging open with scattered pages on the floor beneath it. When David climbed up to investigate, he found the attic completely empty except for a thick layer of dust that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. The journal pages on the hallway floor crumbled to ash when Catherine tried to pick them up, leaving no evidence of what had transpired. The family moved away within the week, unable to bear losing both children to the same inexplicable fate. The house stood empty for months before being purchased by a developer who planned to renovate it completely. During the renovation, workers sealed the attic access permanently, installing a new ceiling that made the space completely inaccessible. They reported no strange sounds, no cold spots, no whispered voices. The door remained closed. In Manchester, life went on. Children played in the streets, laughed in their homes, and slept peacefully in their beds, never knowing that somewhere between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond, a 17-year-old boy stood eternal guard, keeping his promise to protect them all. Sometimes, on quiet autumn nights when the wind rattles windows just so, people passing the renovated house might catch a glimpse of movement in the sealed attic space. But it's not threatening. It's the shadow of a guardian, a brother who chose love over fear, sacrifice over safety. The voices in the attic fell silent forever. their hunger satisfied not with innocence, but with the willing courage of someone who understood that sometimes the greatest protection requires the ultimate sacrifice, and in that silence there is peace. The Volvo's engine died with a mechanical wheeze, leaving Dr. Margaret Thornfield alone with the suffocating silence of the Canadian wilderness. Through her windshield, the cabin materialized from the fog like something birthed from a fever dream. Withered cedar walls, a sagging porch, and windows that stared back at her with the hollow gaze of a corpse. She stepped onto the gravel driveway, her boots crunching against stones that seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it. The October air bit at her exposed skin, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and wrong. Margaret had investigated over 200 paranormal cases across 3 continents, but none had intrigued her quite like this one. The Henderson family had fled this cabin in Whistler after just 4 days, claiming they couldn't sleep, couldn't think, couldn't even hold a conversation without feeling like their minds were being slowly pulled apart. 3 previous tenants had reported similar experiences over the past 18 months. The local authorities had found nothing. No gas leaks, no electrical issues, no structural problems that might explain the phenomenon. But Margaret knew better than to trust official reports when it came to the unexplained. She hauled her equipment cases from the car: electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, audio recording devices, and her grandmother's old spirit board, wrapped carefully in black velvet. The locals in the nearby town of Pemberton had warned her against staying here, their eyes growing distant when she mentioned the property on Maple Ridge Road. Old Tom at the gas station had simply shaken his head and muttered something about the sound that never stops. The front door key turned easily, too easily, as if the house were eager to welcome her inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, it began. A low, almost inaudible hum seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't mechanical. She'd ruled that out during her preliminary research. The sound existed at the very edge of human perception, a frequency that seemed to vibrate not just through her ears, but through her bones, her teeth, the soft tissue of her brain. Margaret set down her cases in the main living area, noting how the furniture had been arranged in perfect symmetry. 2 chairs facing each other across a coffee table, pictures hanging at precise intervals along the walls. The symmetry felt deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if the house itself demanded order. She pulled out her electromagnetic detector first, watching as the needle immediately jumped into the red zone. The readings were off the charts, but they weren't random. They pulsed in rhythm with the humming, like a massive heartbeat buried deep within the earth. Night fell quickly in the mountains, and with it came an intensification of the phenomenon. Margaret had set up her base of operations in the kitchen, spreading her equipment across the farmhouse table while she reviewed the case files. 3 families, 12 people in total, all reporting the same symptoms: insomnia, paranoia, vivid nightmares, and a growing compulsion to harm themselves or others. The hum grew stronger after midnight. She tried to focus on her notes, but the sound seemed to crawl inside her skull, making her thoughts feel thick and sluggish. Every few minutes, she found herself staring at blank pages, unable to remember what she'd been writing. The pen in her hand felt impossibly heavy. Margaret forced herself to walk through the house, documenting everything with her camera. The basement door was locked, but she found the key hanging on a nail beside the frame, again, as if the house wanted to be explored. The wooden steps creaked under her weight as she descended into darkness. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing stone walls that wept with moisture and a floor made of packed earth. But it was the far corner that made her breath catch in her throat. Someone had carved symbols into the stone, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the dancing beam of her flashlight. They were old, far older than the cabin above, and they pulsed with the same rhythm as the humming. Margaret had studied occult symbology for years, but these markings were unlike anything in her reference books. They seemed to hurt her eyes to look at directly, as if they existed in dimensions her mind couldn't properly process. She took photographs, though somehow she knew the camera wouldn't capture what she was truly seeing. The symbols seemed alive, crawling across the stone like infected veins. That's when she noticed the source of the humming. In the center of the basement floor, a perfect circle of earth had been carved away, creating a shaft that descended into impenetrable darkness. The sound rose from this pit like the breathing of some enormous, slumbering beast. Margaret knelt beside it, pointing her flashlight downward, but the beam simply vanished into the void. She dropped a coin into the shaft. She never heard it land. The second night brought visitors. Margaret woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin like a predator stalking its prey. But when she looked through the windows, she saw nothing but the twisted silhouettes of pine trees swaying in the wind. The humming had grown so loud she could barely think. It filled every space in her head, drowning out her own thoughts and replacing them with whispers in a language that predated human speech. She found herself standing in front of the bathroom mirror at 3 a.m., staring at her reflection while her hand moved of its own accord, scratching symbols into her forearm with her fingernails. The same symbols from the basement. Margaret jerked her hand away, horrified, but the damage was done. The scratches formed perfect geometric patterns, and they hummed with their own internal vibration. She tried to leave on the third day. The Volvo wouldn't start. The engine turned over, sputtered, and died. Again and again. Margaret popped the hood to find the engine block covered in the same symbols that adorned the basement walls, carved deep into the metal as if they'd always been there. Her cell phone had no signal. The landline in the cabin was dead. She was trapped. That afternoon, Margaret discovered the journal. It was hidden behind a loose stone in the basement wall, wrapped in oiled leather that had somehow remained pristine despite decades in the damp. The handwriting inside belonged to Dr. Heinrich Vollmer, a German archaeologist who had purchased this land in 1943. Vollmer's entries detailed his excavation of what he believed to be a pre-Columbian sacred site. He'd found evidence of rituals dating back thousands of years, ceremonies designed to communicate with entities that existed between the spaces of reality. The indigenous peoples of the region had built the shaft as a conduit, a direct line to something that dwelled in the deep places of the earth. But Vollmer had made a mistake. In his arrogance, he'd assumed he could control what came through the conduit. He performed the ritual himself, opening a doorway that had been sealed for good reason. The final entry was barely legible, written in what looked like blood. It speaks to me now, always. The humming never stops. I understand what it wants. A permanent anchor in our world. A vessel it can inhabit. I built this cabin over the shaft to contain it, but I fear I've only made it stronger. The symbols I've carved into every surface are meant to bind it, but they're failing. Each person who enters this place weakens the barriers a little more. Soon, very soon, it will break free entirely. God forgive me for what I've done. Margaret looked up from the journal to find she was no longer alone in the basement. Shadows moved in the corners where her flashlight couldn't reach. Not the absence of light, but something far more substantial. The humming rose to a crescendo that made her ears bleed, and she could finally understand what it was saying. It was counting down to 0. The thing in the shaft had been patient, feeding on the fear and madness of everyone who entered its domain, growing stronger with each terrified soul. Margaret was simply the latest in a long line of offerings, and she would not be the last. She ran upstairs, desperate to escape, but found the front door sealed shut as if it had been welded closed. The windows wouldn't break, no matter how hard she struck them with chairs, lamps, anything she could find. The house had become her prison, and she was being prepared for something far worse than death. On the 5th night, Margaret understood her true purpose. She found herself walking down to the basement without conscious decision, her feet carrying her against her will. The symbols on the walls glowed with sickly phosphorescence, and the shaft in the center of the floor had grown wider, its edges crumbling inward as if the earth itself were being consumed. The humming had evolved into something resembling speech, words in a language that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to the primitive centers of her brain. It promised her knowledge beyond human comprehension, secrets of existence that would make her a god among mortals. All she had to do was step forward. All she had to do was complete the circuit. Margaret's hand moved to the spirit board she'd brought from her grandmother. But as her fingers touched the planchette, she realized the terrible truth. Every paranormal investigator who had entered this place had brought tools designed to communicate with the other side. They'd been unwitting assistants in their own destruction, helping the entity bridge the gap between dimensions. The house had been collecting them, one by one, using their expertise to perfect its escape. She tried to resist, but the humming filled her skull until there was no room for her own thoughts. Her feet shuffled toward the shaft, drawn by a force that made gravity seem weak by comparison. The darkness below churned with malevolent anticipation. Margaret's last coherent thought was a prayer that someone would have the wisdom to burn this place to the ground before it could claim another victim. Then she stepped forward into the void, and her scream joined the eternal chorus rising from the deep places of the earth. The cabin fell silent for exactly 37 minutes. Then the humming began again, stronger than before, carrying with it the voices of all those who had fed its hunger. Margaret's knowledge of the paranormal, her understanding of the boundaries between worlds, had made it more complete, more dangerous. 3 days later, a new for rent listing appeared online, featuring photos of a charming mountain cabin with unique acoustic properties. The description mentioned the peaceful atmosphere and the soothing natural sounds that would help guests achieve the perfect night's sleep. Dr. James Morrison, a paranormal researcher from Edinburgh, saw the listing and immediately booked a week-long stay. He'd heard rumors about the Henderson property and was eager to investigate the claims of supernatural activity. He packed his equipment carefully: electromagnetic detectors, infrared cameras, audio recording devices, and drove north toward Whistler, humming an old Scottish folk song under his breath. The cabin waited, patient as always, its windows reflecting the dying light like hungry eyes. And in the basement, carved deep into stone that had witnessed horrors beyond human comprehension, new symbols began to appear, blueprints for a ritual that would finally tear open the veil between worlds permanently. The house that hummed was almost ready to sing. The darkness below stirred in anticipation, and somewhere in its depths, Margaret's voice joined the chorus, welcoming the next victim home. The rusted sign creaked in the autumn wind, its faded letters barely readable. Hillcrest Guest House, vacancies available. Detective Margaret Collins pulled her coat tighter as she approached the decrepit building on the outskirts of Vancouver. 3 missing persons in 2 months, all last seen checking into room 306. The local police had dismissed it as coincidence, but Margaret knew better. The front desk clerk, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, barely looked up from his newspaper. "Room 306, he wheezed, his voice like gravel scraping concrete. "You sure about that, lady? We got plenty other rooms." Margaret flashed her badge. "I'm investigating the disappearances. Need to see that room." The clerk's face went ashen. He fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling. "Haven't cleaned it in weeks. Nobody stays there anymore. Not after." "After what?" But the man had already turned away, sliding a tarnished brass key across the stained counter. "3rd floor, end of the hall. Don't say I didn't warn you." The elevator groaned and shuddered as it climbed, cable straining against rust and neglect. Margaret's flashlight beam danced across water-stained walls covered in peeling wallpaper. The building felt alive somehow, breathing around her with each creak and groan of settling timber. The 3rd-floor hallway stretched endlessly before her, lit by a single flickering bulb that cast dancing shadows on moth-eaten carpet. Room numbers counted down like a countdown to doom. 310, 308, 306. The door stood slightly ajar. Margaret drew her service weapon, though she wasn't sure what good it would do against whatever lurked behind that door. She pushed it open with her foot, the hinges screaming in protest. The room was ordinary enough at first glance. A double bed with yellowed sheets, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a single window overlooking the parking lot. But the air felt thick, oppressive, like breathing through wet wool. And there was something wrong with the light switch by the door. It flickered on its own. Click. The overhead bulb blazed to life, casting harsh shadows across the room. Click. Darkness swallowed everything. Click. Light again. But this time Margaret saw something that made her blood freeze. Scratch marks covered the walls, deep gouges in the plaster as if someone had clawed desperately, trying to escape. And there, barely visible in the strobing light, dark stains splattered across the ceiling. The temperature plummeted. Margaret's breath came out in visible puffs as she moved deeper into the room. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, each step echoing unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. That's when she heard it, a whisper, so faint she almost missed it, coming from inside the walls themselves. "Help me." Margaret pressed her ear against the wall where the voice seemed strongest. The wallpaper was cold against her cheek, and underneath, she could swear she felt movement, as if something was trapped behind the plaster, scratching weakly to get out. The light switch clicked again, plunging the room into darkness. In the blackness, Margaret heard footsteps shuffling across the floor. Slow, dragging steps, like someone walking with great effort. She fumbled for a flashlight, hands shaking. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. The room was empty, but the footsteps continued, circling around her now, getting closer. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice cracking. "This is the police." The footsteps stopped. In the sudden silence, Margaret became aware of another sound. Breathing. Ragged, labored breathing that definitely wasn't her own. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, the ceiling, even from beneath the floorboards. The light switch began clicking rapidly now, on and off, like a strobe light in a nightmare. In the strobing illumination, Margaret caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, shadows that moved independently of any light source, dark shapes that vanished the moment she turned toward them. She backed toward the door, but it slammed shut with a bang that shook the entire building. The key she'd used to open it was no longer in the lock. She was trapped. The whispers grew louder, multiplying until they became a chorus of desperate voices pleading for help. Margaret recognized one of them, Detective Thompson, who'd gone missing last month while investigating the same case. His voice rose above the others, warning her. "Don't stay till midnight," he whispered urgently. "Whatever you do, don't let them keep you past midnight." Margaret checked her watch. 11:47 p.m. How had so much time passed? She'd only been in the room for what felt like minutes. The lights stopped flickering and stayed on, but now Margaret wished they hadn't. She could see them clearly now. The previous occupants of room 306. They stood in every corner, pressed against the walls, hanging from the ceiling. Translucent figures with hollow eyes and reaching hands, all staring at her with desperate longing. Detective Thompson stood by the window, his uniform torn and bloodied, his face pale as moonlight. "They feed on fear," he mouthed silently. "The more afraid you get, the stronger they become." But how could she not be afraid? The room was crowding with spirits now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. All the people who'd checked into room 306 over the decades and never checked out. They reached for her with phantom fingers, their mouths open in silent screams. Margaret forced herself to think like a detective. There had to be an explanation, a way out. She examined the room more carefully, looking for clues. The scratch marks on the walls weren't random. They formed words, desperate messages carved by previous victims. Beneath the floor, "They buried U.S. here. The foundation holds U.S." Understanding dawned. This wasn't just a haunted room. It was a tomb. Somewhere beneath her feet lay the bodies of every person who'd ever disappeared from room 306. The building itself was built on their remains, trapping their spirits between the world of the living and the dead. 11:55 p.m. The spirits were becoming more solid, more aggressive. They pulled at her clothes, her hair, trying to drag her toward the bed, where she assumed they wanted her to lie down and join them forever. Margaret fought back, swinging her flashlight like a club, but it passed harmlessly through their ethereal forms. The whispers became screams now, a cacophony of anguish that threatened to shatter her sanity. The walls began to bleed, dark liquid seeping through cracks in the plaster. The smell of decay filled the air, so thick she could taste it. 11:58 p.m. In desperation, Margaret grabbed the dresser and hurled it toward the window. Glass exploded outward into the night, letting in a rush of cold air. The spirits recoiled from the fresh wind, their forms wavering like smoke. But it wasn't enough. They regrouped quickly, surrounding her again, their eyes now burning with malevolent hunger. She could feel her strength draining away, her life force being siphoned off to feed their endless appetite. 11:59 p.m. With her last reserves of energy, Margaret drew her service weapon and aimed it not at the spirits, but at the floor. She emptied the entire clip, punching holes through the rotting floorboards. The wood splintered and cracked, revealing the horror beneath. Bones, dozens of human skulls, staring up at her from a makeshift grave. The foundation of the building wasn't concrete and stone. It was built on a mass burial site. The remains of room 300 and SXS victims used as raw materials in some unholy architectural ritual. The spirits let out a collective wail that shattered every remaining window in the building. As the fresh air flooded in, carrying with it the scent of rain and living earth, the phantoms began to fade. "Thank you," Thompson whispered as his form dissolved into mist. "Now we can rest." The clock on the wall chimed midnight, but Margaret was already gone, having squeezed through the broken window onto the fire escape. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, her hands shaking too badly to start the engine for several minutes. Behind her, the Hillcrest guest house stood silent and dark. The flickering light in room 300 and SIXS window had finally gone out. The next morning, Margaret returned with a full forensics team. They found exactly what she expected. Dozens of bodies buried beneath the building, victims spanning decades. The guest house was demolished within a week, the remains given proper burial. But late at night, when Margaret closed her eyes, she could still hear the whispers, still see those desperate, reaching hands. And sometimes, in the darkness of her bedroom, she swore she could hear the faint sound of a light switch clicking on and off, somewhere just beyond the edge of her dreams. Room 306 was gone, but its memory lingered, and Margaret knew that somewhere out there, in another forgotten building on another lonely road, another room 306 was waiting. The dead light would flicker again, and new voices would join the chorus of the lost. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. The Victorian house on Maple Street in Burlington had been empty for 3 years when the Thompson family finally bought it. David Thompson had gotten a promotion at his engineering firm, and his wife Margaret had always dreamed of restoring an old home. Their twin boys, 8-year-old Jake and Lucas, were thrilled at the prospect of having their own rooms for the first time. The house was a steal at $200,000, which should have been their first warning. Properties in Burlington's historic district rarely sold for less than $500,000. But David was focused on the numbers, and Margaret was enchanted by the original hardwood floors and ornate crown molding. The realtor, Mrs. Patterson, had been oddly evasive about the house's history. When Margaret asked why it had been vacant for so long, the woman simply mumbled something about the previous owners relocating suddenly and handed over the keys with trembling fingers. Moving day came on a gray October morning. As the family carried boxes through the front door, Margaret noticed something peculiar about the hardwood floor in the living room. Certain boards seemed to sag slightly, creating an uneven surface that made furniture wobble. She made a mental note to have David examine it later. That first night, as they unpacked in their temporary bedroom setup, the house seemed to settle around them with unusual intensity. Old houses always creaked and groaned, Margaret knew, but these sounds felt different. They came in rhythmic patterns, almost like footsteps pacing back and forth in the room below. "Dad, someone's walking downstairs," Jake whispered from his sleeping bag on the floor. David listened carefully. The creaking was undeniable, but when he crept downstairs with a flashlight, the living room was empty. He tested the floorboards with his weight, and they groaned in response. But the sound was different from what they'd heard upstairs. The next morning brought their first real discovery. Margaret was arranging books on the mantelpiece when she heard a sharp crack from behind her. One of the floorboards near the window had split down the middle, creating a gap just wide enough to peer through. "David, you need to see this," she called. When he knelt beside the split board, a musty smell wafted up from the darkness below. He shined his phone's flashlight through the gap and saw something that made his stomach turn. Scattered in the crawl space beneath the floor were what looked unmistakably like bones. "We need to call the police," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. But David was practical-minded. "Let's not jump to conclusions. This house is over 100 years old. Could be animal bones, maybe from when this was farmland." That evening, after the boys were asleep, they pried up the split board for a better look. David's flashlight beam revealed not just bones, but what appeared to be a complete human skeleton, yellowed with age. A few scattered pieces of rotted cloth clung to the ribs. Margaret stumbled backward, her hand clamped over her mouth. "We have to call someone. The police, the coroner, someone." "And say what?" "That we found human remains in our house. They'll treat this as a crime scene. We'll have to move out while they investigate. We just spent everything we had on this place." The argument that followed was their first real fight in years. Margaret wanted to do the right thing immediately. David wanted to research their options, maybe consult a lawyer first. In the end, exhaustion won, and they agreed to deal with it in the morning. But the house had other plans. Margaret was awakened at 3 a.m. by the sound of creaking floorboards. This time, it wasn't just random settling. The sounds moved in a deliberate pattern across the living room, from the window to the fireplace and back again. When she nudged David awake, the sound stopped immediately. "You're imagining things," he mumbled, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. The next day, while David was at work and the boys were at school, Margaret found herself alone with the house for the first time. She tried to go about her unpacking, but every step across the living room floor produced an answering creak from somewhere else in the room, as if her movements were being mirrored by an invisible presence. When she knelt to examine the loose board again, she noticed something that made her blood freeze. The bones had moved. She was certain the skull had been facing east yesterday, but now it stared directly up at the floorboard opening. That evening, David reluctantly agreed to help her remove the remains. "We'll give them a proper burial in the backyard," he said. "Then we'll refinish the floor and never speak of this again." But when they lifted the first bone, every floorboard in the house began to creak simultaneously. The sound was deafening, like 100 people stomping their feet in protest. The boys came running downstairs in terror. "What's happening?" Lucas cried, clinging to his mother. The creaking stopped the moment David placed the bone back in its original position. Over the next few days, the house's opposition to their presence became impossible to ignore. Whenever they tried to remove any of the bones, the floorboards would groan and crack with supernatural fury. Windows would slam shut. Doors would swing open on their own. The temperature would drop 20 degrees in seconds. But it was the footsteps that truly terrified them. Every night at 3 a.m., the walking would begin. Slow, deliberate steps that traced the exact outline of the bones beneath the floor. Margaret would lie awake counting them. Always the same pattern. 23 steps to the window. Pause. 23 steps to the fireplace. Pause. Repeat. The boys began having nightmares. Jake claimed he saw a thin man in old-fashioned clothes standing at the foot of his bed, pointing toward the floor. Lucas developed a severe stutter and refused to enter the living room. Margaret researched the house's history at the Burlington Historical Society. The records were sparse, but she found a newspaper clipping from 1952 about a man named Charles Whitmore who had disappeared from this very address. He'd been reported missing by his landlord after failing to pay rent for 2 months. The police investigation had turned up nothing. When she showed David the article, his face went pale. The man in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to the figure Jake had described seeing. "He was murdered," Margaret said with certainty. "Someone killed him and hid his body under the floor. And now he can't rest because we know he's there." David wanted to ignore it all, to pretend they could live normally with a skeleton in their living room. But the house wouldn't let them. The footsteps grew louder each night. The cold spots spread to other rooms. Their belongings would mysteriously move around. always ending up arranged to point toward the loose floorboard. The final straw came on their 10th night in the house. Margaret woke to find Jake standing in the living room at 3 a.m., staring down at the gap in the floorboard. His eyes were completely white, rolled back in his head. "He wants to go home," Jake said in a voice that wasn't his own. "He wants to go to his family." When Margaret grabbed her son, his eyes rolled back to normal, and he looked around in confusion. "Mom, why am I down here?" That morning, Margaret called the police while David was at work. Detective Harrison arrived within an hour, a tired-looking man in his 50s, who'd clearly seen his share of unusual cases. "You did the right thing calling," he said after examining the remains. "These bones have been here for decades. We'll need to process this as a potential homicide, even though any perpetrator would likely be dead by now." The coroner's team arrived that afternoon. As they carefully excavated the skeleton, Margaret noticed something remarkable. The house fell completely silent. No more creaking, no more cold spots, no more moving shadows. The bones were identified as belonging to Charles Whitmore through dental records. The investigation revealed that he'd been murdered by his landlord over unpaid rent, then hastily buried beneath the floorboards. The landlord had died in 1967, taking his secret with him. Charles Whitmore was finally given a proper burial in Burlington's Greenwood Cemetery, with the Thompson family in attendance. Margaret had insisted they be there, feeling somehow responsible for his long imprisonment beneath their floor. That night, for the first time since moving in, the house was truly quiet. No footsteps, no creaking, no supernatural protests. The boys slept peacefully in their beds. But at exactly 3 a.m., Margaret was awakened by a different sound. Gentle, almost musical creaking that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't frightening this time. It felt like gratitude. She went to the living room window and looked out at the quiet street. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw a thin man in old-fashioned clothes standing on the sidewalk, tipping his hat in her direction. Then he faded away like morning mist. The Thompson family stayed in the house on Maple Street for 12 more years. They refinished the living room floor, covering the gap where Charles Whitmore had been hidden for so long. The house never bothered them again, but sometimes, on quiet nights, Margaret would hear the softest sound of footsteps overhead. Not pacing this time, but dancing. David eventually learned to live with the knowledge of what they'd found. The boys grew up with the story as part of their family history, a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing requires courage, even when it's inconvenient. And Mrs. Patterson, the realtor, finally admitted to Margaret years later that she'd known about the bones all along. 3 previous potential buyers had discovered them and fled in terror, leaving the house empty for years. "I should have told you," she said with tears in her eyes. "But I hoped maybe someone would finally help that poor man find peace." Margaret squeezed her hand. Someone did. The house on Maple Street still stands today, home to a different family now. The new owners have never reported any supernatural activity, but they did mention one curious thing to their neighbors. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, they hear what sounds like gentle dancing in the empty room upstairs, as if someone is finally celebrating their freedom after decades of waiting in the dark. The autumn rain drummed against the Gothic windows of Blackwood Manor as Victoria stepped through the heavy oak doors for the first time. The inheritance had come as a shock. A distant great-aunt she'd never met had left her this sprawling estate in the Scottish Highlands. The lawyer's letter mentioned only that the mansion had been in the family for centuries, and that it came with certain peculiarities. The main hall stretched before her like a cathedral, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows. Cobwebs draped the crystal chandelier, and dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light, filtering through stained glass windows. But what commanded her attention was the portrait. It dominated the far wall, easily 12 feet tall and 8 feet wide, framed in ornate gold that had tarnished with age. The painting depicted a man in Victorian dress, tall, gaunt, with pale skin and coal-black hair swept back from a high forehead. His eyes were the most striking feature, deep blue, almost violet, and so lifelike they seemed to glisten with moisture. Victoria found herself walking toward it, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The man's gaze followed her movement, or so it seemed. She stopped directly in front of the portrait, craning her neck to take in its full magnificence. Magnificent, isn't it? Victoria spun around, her heart hammering. A woman in her 60s stood by the entrance, gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a black dress that made her appear almost ghostly in the dim light. "I'm Mrs. Thornfield, the housekeeper," the woman continued, her voice carrying a slight Yorkshire accent. "I've been maintaining the manor for your great-aunt these past 40 years. "It's impressive," Victoria managed, glancing back at the portrait. "Who is he?" Mrs. Thornfield's expression darkened. "Lord Aldrich Blackwood built this manor in 1847. That portrait was commissioned shortly before his death." "How did he die?" The housekeeper's hands twisted together. "Some say madness took him. Others whisper of darker things. But I'll tell you this, miss. That painting has been nothing but trouble. Your great-aunt insisted no one was ever to touch it, not even for cleaning." Victoria looked up at the portrait again. Dust and grime dulled the surface, yet somehow the eyes remained crystal clear, as if they'd been recently painted. "Why not?" Mrs. Thornfield moved closer, lowering her voice. "3 people have gone missing from this house over the years. The last was your great-aunt's nephew, Marcus, about 15 years ago. He was fascinated by that portrait, spent hours staring at it. One morning, we found the hall empty except for—" She paused, wrapping her arms around herself. "Except for what?" "Except for wet footprints leading from where he'd been standing to the base of the portrait. And if you look closely at the painting now, in the background, behind Lord Blackwood, you can see figures that weren't there before." Victoria's blood ran cold. She peered at the portrait's background, which depicted the manor's garden. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just shadowy trees and overgrown hedges. But as her eyes adjusted, she began to make out shapes among the foliage, pale faces, partially obscured by branches and shadow. 3 of them. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Is it?" Mrs. Thornfield's voice was barely audible. "I've watched this house for decades. I've seen things that would make your hair turn white. That portrait, it's not just a painting. It's a prison." As if responding to her words, the temperature in the hall plummeted. Victoria's breath began to mist, and the hairs on her arms stood on end. The painted eyes seemed to brighten, becoming more vivid, more alive. "I should prepare your room," Mrs. Thornfield said quickly. "Best not to linger here after dark." She hurried away, leaving Victoria alone with the portrait. That night, Victoria lay in the 4-poster bed in what had been her great-aunt's room, listening to the manor's settling sounds. Every creak and groan seemed amplified in the darkness. She'd drawn the heavy curtains, but moonlight still leaked through, casting strange shadows across the ornate wallpaper. Around midnight, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps on the wooden floor, accompanied by what sounded like water dripping. Victoria held her breath, straining to listen. The footsteps paused outside her door, and she could swear she heard breathing, deep, labored breaths that seemed to echo from all directions. Then silence. She waited another hour before creeping to the door and pressing her ear against it. Nothing. Gathering her courage, she opened it a crack and peered into the hallway. It was empty, but the carpet was soaked with water that led from her door toward the main staircase. Following the trail on trembling legs, Victoria descended to the main hall. The portrait dominated the space as before, but something had changed. Lord Blackwood's eyes seemed brighter, more focused, and his lips, hadn't they been pressed together before? Now they appeared slightly parted, as if he were about to speak. Victoria approached slowly, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floor. As she drew closer, she noticed that the painted man's clothing appeared damp, water droplets glistening on his dark coat. The background figures were clearer now, too, their faces turned toward her with expressions of desperate longing. "What do you want?" she whispered to the portrait. The painted eyes shifted, looking directly at her. Victoria stumbled backward, a scream catching in her throat. But she couldn't look away. The portrait seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and she felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to touch the canvas. Her hand rose of its own accord. "No!" Mrs. Thornfield's voice cracked through the air like a whip. The housekeeper stood at the bottom of the stairs, her face white with terror. "Don't touch it. Whatever you do, don't touch it." Victoria's hand froze inches from the canvas. She could feel heat radiating from the painting, and for a moment she could swear she heard voices whispering from within, pleading, warning, begging for release. "Come away," Mrs. Thornfield urged, grabbing Victoria's arm. "Come away now." They retreated to the kitchen, where Mrs. Thornfield made tea with shaking hands. "I should have warned you more strongly," she said. "The portrait, it calls to people, especially family members. It wants to add to its collection." "Collection? The missing people. They're not dead, miss. They're trapped inside the painting, conscious but unable to move, unable to speak. They can only watch as Lord Blackwood uses their life force to maintain his own existence." Victoria's cup rattled against the saucer. "That's impossible. Paintings aren't alive." "This one is. Lord Blackwood dabbled in dark arts before his death. Some say he made a pact with something ancient and evil. The portrait was meant to grant him immortality, but instead it became his tomb and his hunting ground. Why doesn't someone just destroy it?" Mrs. Thornfield's eyes were haunted. "Your great-aunt tried once, years ago. She hired men to remove it, but they couldn't lift it from the wall. It seemed to weigh tons. Then she attempted to burn it, but the flames wouldn't take. The painting protects itself." They sat in silence until dawn, but even in daylight, the manor felt oppressive. Victoria spent the day exploring other rooms, trying to avoid the main hall, but she found herself drawn back repeatedly. Each time, the portrait seemed different. The angle of Lord Blackwood's head, the intensity of his stare, the clarity of the background figures. By the third day, Victoria could no longer deny what was happening. The portrait was alive, and it was hunting her. She'd wake to find wet footprints leading to her door. Objects in her room would be moved. Books opened to pages about dark magic. Mirrors turned to reflect the main hall. Windows that faced away from the portrait, somehow showing its reflection in the glass. The whispers grew louder too. During the day, she'd catch fragments of voices calling her name, begging her to come closer. At night, she'd hear what sounded like sobbing coming from the direction of the main hall. Mrs. Thornfield found her on the fourth morning, standing at the top of the main staircase in her nightgown, staring down at the portrait. "Miss Victoria?" The housekeeper's voice was gentle but urgent. "You need to leave this place. Today." Victoria didn't turn around. "I can see them clearly now. The people in the background. There's a woman in a 1920s dress, a man in a military uniform, and someone younger. That must be Marcus. They're trying to warn me." "Then listen to them. Pack your things and go." "I can't." Victoria's voice was dreamy, distant. "He won't let me. Every time I try to leave, I find myself back here, staring at him. He's so beautiful, so lonely. He just needs one more." Mrs. Thornfield grabbed Victoria's shoulders, spinning her around. "Fight it. This is what happened to the others. The painting clouds your mind, makes you sympathetic to him. Lord Blackwood was a monster in life, and death hasn't changed that." Victoria blinked, seeming to come back to herself. I was going to touch it, wasn't I? Just now, before you came." "Yes, and if you had, you'd be in there with the others now, watching helplessly as he used your life to sustain his cursed existence." They tried to leave that afternoon. Victoria packed her bags and loaded them into her car, but as she drove down the winding road away from Blackwood Manor, she found herself turning around. 3 times she attempted to leave, and 3 times she was drawn back. "It's too late," she told Mrs. Thornfield as evening approached. "He has some hold on me now. I can feel him in my mind, showing me things." "What things?" "The truth about his death. He didn't die of madness or disease. He completed a ritual, one that required him to sacrifice his mortality for eternal life. But something went wrong. Instead of becoming immortal, He became trapped between life and death, bound to the portrait. That night, Victoria didn't even pretend to sleep. She sat in her room, fighting the compulsion to go downstairs, but it grew stronger with each passing hour. By 3 in the morning, she was drenched in sweat from the effort of resisting. At 3:33 a.m., the pull became irresistible. She walked downstairs like a sleepwalker, her movements jerky and unnatural. The portrait seemed to glow in the darkness, Lord Blackwood's eyes burning with triumph. The background figures were more visible than ever, pressing against what looked like glass, their mouths open in silent screams. "Please," she whispered as her hand rose toward the canvas. "I don't want to die." "You won't die," a voice seemed to whisper from the painting. "You live forever as I have, beautiful and eternal, preserved in art for all time." Her fingertips were inches from the surface when Mrs. Thornfield appeared, carrying something heavy. "Forgive me, miss," the housekeeper said, and struck the back of Victoria's head with a brass candlestick. Victoria crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Mrs. Thornfield quickly dragged her away from the portrait, which seemed to darken with rage. The painted eyes followed them, and for a moment she could swear she heard Lord Blackwood's voice echoing through the hall, promising vengeance. When Victoria woke, she was in a hospital in Edinburgh. Mrs. Thornfield sat beside her bed, looking years older than she had just days before. "How?" Victoria croaked. "I called the police. Told them you'd had an accident. They found you unconscious in the hall. I said you'd slipped and hit your head on the marble floor. But the portrait is still there, still waiting. But you're free of it now. The hold it had on you was broken when you lost consciousness. Sometimes that's enough." Victoria stared at the ceiling. "What about you? Want to call to you." Mrs. Thornfield smiled sadly. "I'm too old, too weak to be of use to him. Lord Blackwood prefers younger victims, those with strong life force. But I'll continue to watch over the manor, to make sure no one else falls prey to that cursed thing." Victoria left Scotland that week, never looking back. She sold the manor to a historical society, with strict instructions that the main hall be sealed off, and the portrait never be moved or touched. But sometimes, late at night, she still dreams of those painted eyes watching her, and on those nights, she wakes to find her windows reflecting not her bedroom, but a grand hallway dominated by a massive portrait. In the painting, Lord Blackwood's eyes burn with patient hunger, and behind him, among the shadowy figures, she can sometimes make out Mrs. Thornfield's face, kind and warning, her mouth forming silent words. "Don't come back." Victoria never did return to Blackwood Manor, but she kept track of it through newspaper clippings and internet searches. The Historical Society eventually abandoned the project after 3 researchers went missing during their initial survey. The manor was boarded up and left to decay. Yet every few years, there were reports. Hikers who claimed to see lights in the windows, local teenagers who dared each other to break in, only to be found the next morning standing catatonic in front of a portrait that shouldn't exist in an empty, derelict building. The portrait that watches, waiting patiently for its next victim, collecting souls like collector gathers butterflies, pinned and preserved for eternity, beautiful and terrible and forever trapped behind glass and canvas, in a prison that wears the mask of art. And in the background of that cursed painting, if you knew where to look, you could see them all. Every victim, every stolen life, pressing against the boundaries of their painted world, trying desperately to warn the living of the hunger that watches from those beautiful damned eyes. The portrait that watches and waits and whispers promises of eternal beauty to those foolish enough to listen. Forever. The van's headlights cut through the dense fog as it wound up the treacherous path to Hollow Hill. Inside, 5 ghost hunters sat in tense silence, their equipment cases rattling with each bump in the road. The abandoned Victorian mansion loomed ahead, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring down at them through the mist. Marcus, the team leader, gripped the steering wheel tighter as he navigated the final turn. Behind him, his crew prepared their gear with practiced efficiency. Damon checked the batteries on their thermal cameras, while Victoria tested the EMF detectors. The twins, Oliver and Nathan, synchronized their audio recording equipment, their identical faces pale in the dashboard's green glow. The Blackthorn Manor had stood empty for over a century, perched on the highest point of Hollow Hill like a crown of decay. Local legends whispered of the curse that had befallen the wealthy family who once called it home. One by one, they had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind only their anguished spirits and the warning that echoed through generations: all who enter shall join the lost. As they approached the wrought iron gates, Marcus felt an icy chill creep up his spine, despite the van's heating. The gates stood wide open, as if beckoning them forward. He had investigated dozens of supposedly haunted locations across England, but something about this place felt different, more alive, more hungry. Temperature just dropped 15 degrees, Victoria announced, her breath now visible in small puffs. The EMF detector in her lap began emitting soft, rhythmic beeps. "We're not even inside yet," Damon muttered, adjusting his thermal camera. Through its screen, he could see the manor's exterior walls glowing an unnatural blue-white, far colder than the surrounding air. The van crunched to a halt on the gravel driveway. Through the windshield, they could see the manor's front door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Somewhere in the distance, an owl's haunting cry pierced the silence. Marcus turned to face his team. "Remember the plan. We start in the main hall, work our way through each room systematically. Stay in pairs, keep your radios on, and document everything." He paused, studying their faces. "And remember what happened to the last team that came here. 3 years ago, a group of paranormal investigators from Manchester had entered Blackthorn Manor. Only one emerged, found wandering the moors 3 days later. His hair turned completely white, speaking in voices that weren't his own. He now resided in a psychiatric facility, claiming that his colleagues were still inside the house, trapped between worlds. They unloaded their equipment in the shadow of the manor's imposing facade. Gothic spires twisted skyward like gnarled fingers, and gargoyles perched along the roofline seemed to track their movements. The front steps were cracked and moss-covered, leading to a doorway that yawned open like a mouth. The locals say the Blackthorn family was cursed by a witch they burned in the town square, Nathan whispered as they climbed the steps. She swore their bloodline would never find peace. "Folklore," Marcus replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "We deal in facts, not fairy tales." But as they crossed the threshold into the manor's main hall, even Marcus couldn't deny the oppressive atmosphere that settled over them like a suffocating blanket. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded Damon of funeral flowers. Their flashlight beams revealed a grand staircase sweeping up to the second floor, its banister carved with intricate roses that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes following the team as they moved deeper into the house. At the far end of the hall, a massive chandelier hung at an odd angle, its crystals catching their lights and throwing fractured rainbows across the peeling wallpaper. "Getting strong readings here," Victoria announced, her EMF detector now beeping rapidly. "Something's definitely active." They set up their base camp in the main hall, arranging cameras and monitoring equipment with methodical precision. Oliver and Nathan positioned sensitive microphones in opposite corners, hoping to capture any disembodied voices. The twins had made their reputation recording electronic voice phenomena, and they approached each investigation with scientific rigor. As they worked, the house seemed to settle around them, creaking and groaning like an old ship in a storm. But there was a pattern to the sounds, almost like whispered conversations in rooms they couldn't see. "There," Nathan said suddenly, pressing his headphones tighter against his ears. "Did you hear that?" Through the speakers came a faint voice, barely audible above the static. "Join us, join us." The team exchanged glances. They had been in the house for less than an hour. "Could be residual energy," Marcus suggested, though he was already feeling the first tendrils of unease creeping into his mind. "Let's investigate the dining room." The dining room lay beyond the main hall, accessible through ornate double doors that stood slightly ajar. As they pushed them open, the hinges screamed in protest, the sound echoing through the manor like a banshee's wail. Inside, a long table dominated the room, set for a feast that had never been served. Plates and goblets sat exactly where they had been placed over a century ago, covered in dust and spider webs. The chairs were pulled out at odd angles, as if the diners had left in great haste. Damon swept the room with his thermal camera, noting the cold spots that seemed to move independently of any drafts. "Something's wrong with this place," he murmured. "The temperature variations don't make sense. It's like the cold is alive." Victoria's EMF detector was now screaming, the needle pegged at maximum. She fumbled with the controls, trying to recalibrate the device, but it continued its electronic shriek until she finally switched it off. "Equipment malfunction?" Marcus asked. "No," Victoria replied, her voice tight with worry. "This device has never failed before. Something here is generating massive electromagnetic disturbances." As if in response to her words, the chandelier above their heads began to sway gently, its crystals chiming together in a melody that sounded almost like a lullaby. The sound was beautiful and terrifying, filling the room with an otherworldly harmony that seemed to resonate in their bones. Oliver was the first to notice the change. His brother Nathan stood perfectly still beside the dining table, his face slack, his eyes reflecting the flashlight beams like mirrors. "Nathan." Oliver reached out to touch his twin shoulder. When Nathan turned, his expression was no longer his own. His face held the refined features of someone from another era, someone who had once sat at this very table. When he spoke, his voice carried the cultured accent of Victorian nobility. "Welcome to Blackthorn Manor," Nathan said, though the words came from someone else's memory. "I am Lord Blackthorn, and you are my guests now. Forever." The others backed away instinctively as Nathan moved with unfamiliar grace to the head of the table. He placed his hands on the high-backed chair as if he had done so 1,000 times before. "The curse," he continued, his eyes focusing on something beyond their vision. "She came to us in the night. That wretched woman we condemned spoke her dying words as the flames consumed her flesh. 'Your bloodline shall know no rest,' she said. 'The walls of your home shall be your tomb.'" Marcus grabbed his radio, but it produced only static. Their escape route to the van might as well have been on another planet. The house had closed around them like a trap. Victoria tried to move toward the door, but found her feet rooted to the spot. A presence was wrapping itself around her consciousness like ivy around stone. She could feel memories that weren't her own flooding her mind. Memories of a woman in an elegant gown, pacing these very rooms, waiting for a husband who would never return from his business in London. "I waited so long," Victoria heard herself say, though she fought against the words. "Night after night, watching from a window. He promised he would return by Christmas. But Christmas came and went, and I was alone with the servants and the terrible silence." Her voice had changed, taking on the cadence of a grieving widow. She looked down at her modern clothes and seemed confused, as if expecting to see silk and lace. Damon was backing toward the door, his thermal camera clutched in trembling hands, when he felt something brush against his neck. Through the camera's screen, he could see a figure standing directly behind him, a tall man in Victorian dress, his face gaunt with starvation. "The wine cellar," Damon found himself saying, though the words felt foreign in his mouth. "I hid there when the sickness came, barricaded myself in with bottles and wheels of cheese, thinking I could wait it out. But the hunger, oh, the hunger." His modern rationality fought against the invading consciousness, but the spirit of the starving man was stronger, fed by decades of anguish and rage. Damon's hands, no longer under his control, began clawing at his throat, as if trying to tear away invisible bonds. Only Marcus and Oliver remained themselves, though they could feel the presence of other spirits pressing against their minds like fingers testing the strength of glass. The house was full of the dead, each seeking a living vessel to carry their unfinished business. "We have to get out," Marcus whispered, but even as he spoke, he knew it was too late. The front door, their lifeline to the outside world, slammed shut with a sound like thunder. The windows, previously broken and open to the night air, were now covered with what looked like black ice, sealing them inside. Oliver tried to reach his possessed brother, but Nathan, or the spirit controlling him, held up a warning hand. The witch's curse was thorough. Nathan/Lord Blackthorn explained with terrible calm. We cannot leave, and neither can you. The living must replace the dead, or the cycle continues forever. We have been waiting so long for new residents. The house around them seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Shadows moved independently of their light sources, and the walls themselves appeared to breathe. Through the manor's sealed windows, they could see faces pressed against the glass from the inside, the faces of previous visitors who had never left. Marcus felt something cold settle over his thoughts like a shroud. The spirit seeking to possess him was that of a young boy, the Blackthorn heir who had died of scarlet fever in his nursery upstairs. The child's consciousness was innocent but desperate, lonely after a century of wandering empty corridors. Please, the boy's voice whispered through Marcus's lips. I just want to play. It's been so long since I've had friends. Oliver was the last to succumb, fighting valiantly against the elderly butler who had served the Blackthorn family for 40 years before a heart attack claimed him in the pantry. The servant spirit was methodical and patient, gradually overwhelming Oliver's resistance with the persistence of someone accustomed to managing a great household. By midnight, the 5 ghost hunters stood in the dining room, their bodies inhabited by the spirits of Blackthorn Manor's former residents. They moved with the mannerisms of another age, speaking in voices that belonged to the long dead. Lord Blackthorn, wearing Nathan's form, took his place at the head of the table. Lady Blackthorn, in Victoria's body, sat at his right hand, her modern clothes somehow seeming less incongruous as she carried herself with aristocratic bearing. The starving man who had claimed Damon positioned himself near the servant's entrance, while the young heir in Marcus's body fidgeted in his chair with childlike energy. The butler in Oliver's form stood ready to serve, his posture perfect despite his borrowed anatomy. At last, Lord Blackthorn said, surveying his reconstituted household, the family is together again. But their reunion was not permanent. As dawn approached, the spirits began to fade, retreating to whatever corners of the manor housed their earthly remains. The living ghost hunters found themselves alone again, their memories of the possession fragmentary and dreamlike. They discovered they could not leave. Every attempt to exit the manor resulted in them finding themselves back in the main hall, as if the house itself was a maze with no outlet. Their vehicle sat in the driveway, visible through the windows, but impossible to reach. Days blended into nights. They survived on the preserved foods they found in the manor's pantry, though they needed little sustenance. The house sustained them in ways they didn't understand, feeding them with its own dark energy. Each night, as darkness fell, the spirits returned stronger than before. The possessions lasted longer, became more complete. The ghost hunters found themselves spending more and more time as passengers in their own bodies, watching helplessly as the dead lived through them. Victoria was the first to stop fighting the lady's presence entirely. The spirit's memories of elegant dinner parties and refined society were a welcome escape from their grim reality. Gradually, she began to dress her hair in the style the lady preferred, even when she was in control of her own body. Damon found himself drawn to the wine cellar, where he would sit for hours among the dusty bottles, feeling the starving man's presence like a constant ache in his stomach. He began to understand the desperation that had driven the man to barricade himself away from the world, even as that same isolation had led to his doom. The twins, Oliver and Nathan, became lost in their respective possessions. Nathan embraced his role as Lord Blackthorn, studying the manor's history with obsessive detail. Oliver found comfort in the butler's ordered existence, maintaining the house as if the family might return at any moment. Marcus, inhabited by the child spirit, spent his days in the nursery, playing with toys that crumbled to dust at his touch. The boy's innocence was a cruel counterpoint to their trapped existence, his cheerful chatter constant reminder of the life that had been stolen from him. Months passed, or perhaps years. Time moved differently in Blackthorn Manor, flowing like honey in some moments and racing like a river in others. The outside world became a distant memory, glimpsed occasionally through windows that showed them seasons changing but never offered escape. New ghost hunters arrived eventually, drawn by the same legends and stories that had brought the original team. They found the manor apparently empty, though their equipment registered massive paranormal activity. They set up their base camp in the main hall, arranging cameras and monitoring equipment with methodical precision. From the shadows, 5 figures watched the newcomers with hungry eyes. Marcus, Victoria, Damon, Oliver, and Nathan had become permanent residents of Blackthorn Manor, their living bodies now houses for the dead. They understood their role in the cycle, the terrible necessity of what was to come. The witch's curse continued, patient and eternal. The living would replace the dead, and the dead would find new vessels for their unfinished business. Blackthorn Manor would never be empty, never be silent, never be at peace. As the new team of investigators began their work, unaware of the fate that awaited them, the original ghost hunters felt a mixture of sorrow and anticipation. They remembered their own arrival, their own confidence, their own ignorance of the trap that had closed around them. Soon, there would be new voices in the manor's halls, new bodies for old spirits to inhabit, new prisoners in the endless dance of possession and despair. The curse of Hollow Hill continued, as it always had, as it always would, until the last star burned out and the world itself grew cold and still. And even then, perhaps, the spirits of Blackthorn Manor would endure, waiting in their Victorian prison for new guests to welcome into their eternal, cursed family. In the main hall, the chandelier began to sway gently, its crystals chiming together in that beautiful, terrible lullaby that had welcomed so many visitors over the decades. The sound drifted through the manor's corridors like a siren song, calling the living to join the ranks of the forever lost. The cycle was beginning anew, and Hollow Hill kept its secrets, as it always had, as it always would. The windshield wipers fought against the October rain as Margaret drove through the winding roads of the Yorkshire countryside. The job advertisement had been peculiar, posted in an obscure corner of a London newspaper. Nanny required for special child. Discretion essential. Excellent compensation. Contact Whitmore Estate. She pulled up to the imposing Victorian mansion just as thunder rolled across the moors. Gargoyles perched on the corners of the roof seemed to watch her with stone eyes as she hurried through the downpour to the heavy oak door. Mr. Whitmore answered on the first knock, as if he had been waiting by the window. He was a thin man in his 70s, with silver hair and eyes that darted nervously. Behind him stood his wife, Victoria, equally aged but with the steely determination in her gaze. "You must be Margaret," Mr. Whitmore said, ushering her into a dimly lit foyer. Oil paintings of stern ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her movement. "Please, come in from this dreadful weather." The house felt wrong immediately. The air was too cold, too still, and there was an underlying scent of decay that the fresh flowers couldn't quite mask. Margaret had worked in dozens of homes during her 15 years as a nanny, but none had made her skin crawl like this. "Tea," Victoria offered, leading her into a sitting room where a fire crackled in an ornate fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows across the room, making the furniture appear to move when Margaret wasn't looking directly at it. "Thank you," Margaret replied, settling into a chair that felt damp despite being near the fire. "Your advertisement mentioned a special child." The elderly couple exchanged a glance that spoke of secrets and sorrow. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat. "Our grandson, Thomas. He's unique. He requires very specific care." "What kind of care?" Margaret asked, noting how Victoria's hands trembled as she poured the tea. "He stays in the nursery on the 3rd floor," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The room with the blue door. You must never, under any circumstances, open that door." Margaret frowned. "How am I supposed to care for a child if I can't enter his room?" "You leave his meals outside the door," Mr. Whitmore explained. 3 times a day. You read to him through the door. You sing lullabies, but you never, ever go inside. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. How long has he been in there? Another weighted glance between the couple. Since the accident, Victoria said, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. 43 years now. Margaret nearly dropped her teacup. 43 years? But that would make him. Time moves differently for Thomas, Mr. Whitmore interrupted. He's still our little boy, still 6 years old, with golden hair and blue eyes like his mother. The logical part of Margaret's mind screamed at her to leave, but the compensation they offered was 3 times her usual rate. She had debts to pay, a sick mother to care for. Against her better judgment, she accepted. Her room was on the 2nd floor, directly below the nursery. That first night, she lay in the narrow bed listening to the sounds above. Soft footsteps paced back and forth across the ceiling. A child's voice hummed a melody she didn't recognize, but it made her teeth ache. Sometimes there was laughter, but it was the wrong kind of laughter. Too knowing, too old. The next morning, Victoria showed her the routine. They climbed the narrow staircase to the 3rd floor, past portraits of children with hollow eyes and sad smiles. The blue door stood at the end of the hallway, its paint peeling like diseased skin. "Thomas, darling," Victoria called softly. "Your new nanny is here. Her name is Margaret." A voice came from behind the door, high and sweet, but somehow wrong. "Hello, Margaret. Will you play with me?" Margaret's blood turned to ice water. The voice sounded normal enough, but there was something underneath it, something that made her think of things that had been buried too long. "I'll read you stories, Thomas," she managed to say. "Would you like that?" "Oh, yes," came the reply. "I love stories about the outside world, about people who can leave their rooms." That first week passed in a haze of unease. Margaret established her routine. Breakfast outside the blue door at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Between meals, she would sit in the hallway reading children's books aloud. Thomas would ask questions about the stories, about the world beyond the house, about her life before coming to Whitmore Estate. But it was the nights that truly frightened her. The pacing above her room never stopped. Sometimes she heard scratching, as if fingernails were being dragged across wood. Once she was certain she heard sobbing, but when she crept upstairs to listen at the door, she found only silence. The Whitmores grew more nervous with each passing day. They would jump at sudden noises, whisper in corners, and sometimes she caught them staring at the ceiling with expressions of pure terror. "Has Thomas always been contained?" Margaret asked Victoria one morning as they prepared his breakfast tray. Victoria's face went pale. "You don't understand, dear. Thomas isn't contained. We are. This house, this family, we're all trapped by what Thomas has become." "What happened to him?" Victoria's hands shook as she arranged the food on the tray. "It was my fault. I was watching him that day, 43 years ago. He was playing in the garden, near the old well. I only looked away for a moment, just long enough to answer the telephone. When I came back..." She broke off, unable to continue. "He fell in the well," Margaret prompted. "He drowned," Victoria whispered. "My sweet little grandson drowned in that dark water while I was chatting about bridge games. When we pulled him out, he was already gone. Had been for hours." Margaret felt the room spin around her. "But Thomas is upstairs. I talk to him every day." "That's not Thomas," Victoria said, her voice cracking. "That's what came back wearing his face." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the footsteps above. They seemed more frantic now, as if whatever was up there knew she'd learned the truth. Around midnight, the pacing stopped. In the silence that followed, she heard her name being called. Margaret. The voice was Thomas's, but distorted, like it was coming from underwater. "Margaret, I'm so lonely. Please come play with me." She buried her head under the pillow, but the voice seemed to come from inside her skull now. "I know you want to see me, Margaret. I know you're curious. Everyone is, eventually. Just turn the handle. Just open the door." The next morning, She found scratch marks on the outside of the blue door. They hadn't been there the day before. The door shows the marks when Thomas gets excited. Mr. Whitmore explained when she asked. It's been happening more frequently since you arrived. What? He likes you, Victoria said with a haunted expression. He wants to show you his room, but you mustn't let him. The last nanny who opened the door. What happened to her? The couple wouldn't meet her eyes. Margaret tried to leave that afternoon, but her car wouldn't start. The phone lines were down. The nearest village was 20 miles away across the moors, and a thick fog had rolled in, making navigation impossible. You can't leave now anyway, Victoria said when Margaret announced her intention to walk to town. Thomas is too attached. If you try to abandon him, he'll what? He'll follow you. That night, the sounds from upstairs grew more violent. Something heavy was being dragged across the floor. Glass broke. A child's voice screamed in rage and frustration. Margaret huddled in her bed, clutching a kitchen knife she'd taken from the drawer, though she suspected it would be useless against whatever was up there. Around 3 in the morning, silence fell. Margaret had just begun to relax when she heard the soft creak of footsteps on the stairs. They paused outside her door. Margaret. Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. Why won't you come see me? Don't you like me anymore? She held her breath, praying he would go away. I know you're awake. I can hear your heart beating. Thump, 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 like a little rabbit. Are you afraid of me, Margaret? The door handle turned slowly. Margaret bit down on her knuckle to keep from screaming as the door swung open. The hallway beyond was empty, but she could feel eyes watching her from the darkness. I'm not supposed to leave my room. Thomas's voice drifted from the shadows. But I get so lonely, and I can smell something different about you, Margaret. Something alive. The temperature in the room plummeted. Margaret's breath came out in white puffs as ice began forming on the windows. Would you like to see my room now, Margaret? I've been decorating it just for you. The next morning, Victoria found Margaret's room empty. The bed hadn't been slept in, but there were muddy footprints leading from the door to the window. Footprints that looked like they'd been made by someone walking underwater. Mr. Whitmore found her upstairs, standing in front of the blue door with her hand on the handle. Don't, he pleaded. Please, not you too. But Margaret's eyes were glassy and focused. Thomas has been showing me such wonderful things, she said in a voice not quite her own. Did you know there's a whole world down in the dark water? He wants me to see it all. Margaret, fight it. That's not Thomas anymore. It's something else, something that crawled up from the bottom of that well and put on his face like a mask. Margaret turned to look at him, and Mr. Whitmore gasped. Her skin was pale and waxy, like something that had been underwater too long. Her eyes were the cloudy white of a drowned person's. Thomas is teaching me to hold my breath, she said with a smile that was too wide. Would you like to learn too? She turned the handle. The door opened with a sound like rushing water. The nursery beyond was not a child's room, but a vision of the bottom of a well. Dark water covered everything, and shapes moved in the depths, shapes that might once have been human. The walls were lined with the belongings of previous caretakers, clothes, jewelry, photographs, all green with algae and decay. In the center of it all stood Thomas. He looked exactly as Victoria had described, golden hair, blue eyes, 6 years old, but his skin was the gray-white of something long dead, and water constantly dripped from his hair and clothes. When he smiled, Margaret could see into the dark hollow of his throat. Welcome to my room, Margaret, he said, his voice echoing as if spoken from the bottom of a deep well. I've been waiting so long for someone new to play with. The water began pouring out of the nursery, flooding the hallway. It was ice cold and carried the stench of decay and stagnant death. Margaret felt it pulling at her legs, dragging her forward into that horrible room where other nannies floated just beneath the surface, their eyes wide and staring. The water's nice once you get used to it, Thomas said, reaching out with hands that were more like waterlogged claws. And we have forever to play games down here in the dark. As the water rose higher, Margaret saw the truth. The well in the garden didn't just claim Thomas that day 43 years ago. It had been hungry for much longer, and Thomas was just its newest servant, luring the living down into its depths to feed whatever ancient thing dwelt at the bottom. The last thing she saw before the dark water closed over her head was the Whitmores, standing helplessly in the hallway as their home filled with the contents of that cursed well. They had tried to contain it by keeping Thomas locked away. But some hungers cannot be caged. Some doors should never be opened, and some wells should have been filled in long ago. The house on the Yorkshire moor still stands, though the locals avoid it now. Sometimes, on foggy nights, people claim they can hear children playing in flooded rooms, and the sound of someone reading stories to an audience that will never grow up. The job advertisements still appear from time to time in London newspapers, always in the same obscure corner. Nanny required for special child. Discretion essential. Excellent compensation. But the blue door on the 3rd floor stands wide open now, and the water never stops flowing. Hashtag the silent house. The moving truck disappeared around Maple Street, leaving Victoria Thorne alone before her inheritance. October wind should have carried autumn sounds, but here at 1847, Maple Street, an unnatural stillness had settled like a burial shroud. The Victorian house loomed against gray sky, its weathered shingles curling like ancient fingernails. Broken shutters hung askew, spider-webbed windows mapping terrible geography. The wraparound porch sagged under decades of neglect, ornate trim rotted and peeling. What had once been grand now testified to time's relentless decay. Victoria clutched the brass key her great-aunt Margot's lawyer had given her 3 days ago, along with a note in Margot's spidery handwriting. Asterisk, the silence protects what should never be heard. Do not disturb what rests within these walls, dear child. Some inheritances are burdens, not gifts. If you must enter, remember, the living and dead were never meant to share the same space. Asterisk, at the time, Victoria had dismissed it as eccentric rambling. Margot had always been the family's black sheep, unmarried, childless, rarely attending gatherings. She'd lived alone in this crumbling Victorian for 60 years, declining all offers of help. When the lawyer called about Margot's death and Victoria's unexpected inheritance, she'd felt curiosity rather than grief. Now, standing before the house with its hollow-eyed windows, Victoria felt her first stirring of unease. The neighborhood was typical Burlington residential, well-maintained colonials, manicured lawns, Halloween pumpkins on doorsteps. But this house existed in its own bubble of decay, as if time moved differently here. The wrought iron gate squeaked as she opened it, the first sound since the truck departed. Dead roses lined the cracked walkway, skeletal branches reaching out. Despite October's chill, pale white roses still bloomed in the overgrown garden, glowing against the gloom with perfect petals amid surrounding decay. As she approached the door, Victoria realized how quiet everything had become. Her footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air absorbed sound. Urban noises, traffic, barking dogs, neighbors had faded to nothing. She paused, looking back toward the street where a woman walked a golden retriever, but Victoria heard nothing. No panting, no claw clicks on pavement. The silence was wrong. Not peaceful, but hungry and oppressive, actively consuming every sound that dared exist. Victoria climbed the porch steps. Each board should have groaned, but didn't. The silence followed her like invisible fog. The burgundy front door bore an ornate brass raven knocker, tarnished black with age. The key turned easily, too easily for such an old lock, and the door swung open in perfect, unsettling silence. She stepped inside and immediately felt she'd entered another world. Her boots made no sound on hardwood floors. She took deliberate steps, trying to make noise, but her movements were completely silent. Even her breathing vanished the moment it left her lips. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was hungry, consuming every sound within these walls. Victoria clapped experimentally. The violent gesture produced nothing. She tried to call out, watching her mouth form words that died before reaching her ears. The entryway was grander than expected. Curved staircase, crystal chandelier, dust motes dancing in afternoon light, but moving in absolute silence. Faded floral wallpaper covered walls lined with stern Victorian portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her. Dust-covered furniture stood like frozen ghosts, but Victoria noticed something peculiar. While most surfaces lay thick with neglect, there were clean patches, perfect rectangles where something had been recently moved. On the mantelpiece, she saw the outline where a clock had stood, but the timepiece was gone. Someone had been here recently, disturbing the long-settled accumulation of time. But according to the lawyer, Margot had lived alone, and the house had been sealed since her death 2 weeks ago. In the parlor, Victoria found more evidence. A chess set sat mid-game, pieces dust-free and gleaming as if just handled. When she reached for a pawn, it felt warm, but her fingers passed through it like air, though her eyes clearly saw it solid and real. The kitchen revealed the most disturbing evidence. A cup of tea sat steaming on the counter, warm to touch, fresh amber liquid scented with bergamot. Beside it lay half-eaten biscuits with scattered crumbs. Victoria's heart began racing. The only sound that survived in this place, growing obscenely loud in the oppressive quiet. The refrigerator was fully stocked with fresh groceries, unexpired milk, crisp vegetables, recent leftovers. No dust, no signs of age. Yet when Victoria tried lifting the milk carton, her hand passed right through like it was holographic. The silence pressed from all sides now. Not just absence, but something actively oppressive. Victoria breathed deeper, though the air felt thick, carrying scents that didn't match what she saw. Cooking food, burning candles, fresh flowers, and underlying it all, something organic and unpleasant she didn't want to identify. She climbed stairs to the second floor, her hand sliding along a banister oddly warm, as if another hand had just released it. Family portraits lining the stairway seemed to watch her progress, painted eyes following her movement, expressions changing slightly as she passed. The hallway stretched back into shadows deeper than afternoon light should allow. The master bedroom door stood ajar, revealing a bed that looked recently slept in. As Victoria approached, she saw pillow impressions, not one but two, side by side. Wrinkled sheets were pulled back, as if someone had just risen. As she watched, the impressions deepened, weight applying to the mattress in real time. The indentations grew pronounced, sheets pulling taut around invisible forms. One pillow compressed further, blankets shifting as someone settled for sleep. The temperature plummeted without warning. Victoria's breath became visible, great soundless puffs hanging accusingly in the air. Window curtains billowed inward as if pushed by invisible presences. Objects shifted in the sudden cold. A silver brush slid across the dresser, leaving trails and dust. Books fell from the nightstand, pages fluttering as invisible hands searched through them. A rocking chair began rhythmic motion, creaking faster and faster. Victoria could see someone's impression in the compressed cushion, but the chair moved without sound despite obvious stress on old wooden joints. Everything happened in terrifying, absolute silence. Victoria ran from the room, feet making no impact sounds, panicked breathing stolen by supernatural quiet. She raced down the hallway past portraits, whose painted mouths were now open as if screaming, faces contorted in warning or terror, their desperate cries forever unheard. Doors opened as she passed, revealing glimpses of activity. In one, someone's shadow sat writing urgently at a desk. Another showed a woman brushing her hair with mechanical repetition. A child's room contained a small figure playing with toys, movements too quick and unnatural for any living child. Approaching the front door, she felt something rush past. Air displacement violent as a speeding truck, but without engine roar. Whatever shared this house was massive, moving with terrifying speed. Wind from its passage ruffled her hair, cold air carrying scents of old roses and funeral parlors. Victoria slammed into the front door, twisting the handle desperately. It wouldn't budge. The door that opened so easily now refused to let her leave. The brass handle was ice cold, frost forming around the door frame. She pounded with both fists, impact vibrations traveling through her body, but no sound confirming her strikes. Behind her, movement erupted in every room simultaneously. Picture frames crashed silently to floors, glass shattering without sound. Dishes fell from kitchen shelves, porcelain breaking apart in complete quiet. Furniture scraped across floors as invisible hands dragged it about. The destruction was enormous, violent, and absolutely silent. Pressing her back against the door, Victoria watched chaos unfold. Then she noticed the most terrifying detail. Shadows moved independently from their objects. While a lamp fell and shattered, its shadow remained upright on the wall. While curtains whipped frantically, their shadows hung perfectly still. The shadows were showing her the truth. In the shadow world dancing across walls, Victoria saw them clearly. Dozens of human figures moving through the house. Men in Victorian suits consulted pocket watches. Women in long dresses served invisible tea. Children played eternal games of tag. The house was crowded with the dead, going about afterlife routines in perfect, eternal silence. And they had noticed her. Shadow figures converged on her location, moving with jerky, unnatural movements. They stretched and contracted like rubber, becoming more distorted as they approached. Victoria saw shadow hands reaching for her, growing longer and skeletal as they extended across walls. Shadow faces pressed close to surfaces, features becoming detailed and desperate. Some shadows looked recent, people from the last few decades in modern clothing. Others appeared ancient, forms suggesting centuries-old garments. A 1940s nurse, a military officer, children in old-fashioned school clothes, servants in simple work attire. They all shared the same urgent expression, the same desperate need to communicate with the living person who had invaded their domain. Their shadow mouths moved frantically, clearly speaking or shouting, but no sound could escape the house's hungry silence. Victoria tried the handle again with all her strength. This time it gave way suddenly, and she stumbled onto the porch. The moment she crossed the threshold, sound crashed back like a tsunami. The cacophony overwhelmed her after oppressive silence. Her heartbeat was deafening, rapid drumming echoing in her skull. Gasping breaths sounded like hurricane winds. Even hair moving in breeze was uncomfortably amplified. But from inside the house, she now heard something that froze her blood. Whispers. Not just a few voices, but hundreds. Overlapping conversations creating a wall of sound. Laughter mixed with crying. Arguments blended with intimate discussions. Children's voices rose above adult conversations. And beneath it all was constant murmuring of prayers, pleas, desperate attempts at communication. The sounds of an entire community of the dead, talking at once in cacophony that had been building in silence for decades. Victoria stumbled down the porch, but voices followed her. Reaching the street, she realized with growing horror that whispers weren't just from the house. They were inside her head, in her skull, behind her eyes, resonating through her bones. She could make out individual conversations now. The baby won't stop crying. Asterisk, mother, where's my blue dress? Asterisk, the fever is getting worse. Please, help me find my way home. She ran to her car, fumbling with keys as voices grew louder. She could hear Great Aunt Margot's voice among them, clearer than the rest. Asterisk, I try to warn you, child. The silence wasn't keeping the dead quiet. It was keeping them contained. Now you've given them a way out. Asterisk, starting the engine. Victoria looked back at 1847, Maple Street. Every window filled with shadow figures, watching her leave. They pressed against glass from inside, forms becoming solid and desperate. Some waved, others pointed at her. A few appeared to be trying to break through windows to follow. The whispers grew more demanding as she drove away. Take us with you. Don't leave us here. We've been so alone. Help us remember what it was like to be alive. Victoria drove through Burlington's quiet streets, but voices never faded. They grew stronger with distance. The silence hadn't been protecting the living from the dead. It had been protecting the dead from the living. The house had contained those souls, keeping them isolated in their soundless prison. But now Victoria had been inside, breathed the same air as shadows, and she carried them with her. The dead had found escape through her, and they weren't letting go. She checked into her bed and breakfast, hoping distance might quiet the voices. But that night they only grew louder. She could hear entire families, mothers reading bedtime stories to children who would never grow up, fathers discussing deals that would never complete, grandparents sharing memories turned to dust. Through sleepless hours, the voices explained in fragmented whispers. The house was built on land where terrible things happened, a place where the boundary between life and death had worn thin through tragedy and time. Everyone who lived there eventually joined the shadow community, unable to leave even in death. The silence had been their prison, but also protection, keeping them contained and preventing their influence from spreading. Margot had been the last living resident, spending 60 years as unwilling guardian, keeping the dead company while preventing their escape. Her death destabilized the balance, and now shadows were desperate for connection with life again. Victoria learned the house's dark history through whispered testimonies. Original owner Edmund Blackwood built it in 1847 after losing his wife and 3 children to tuberculosis. In grief, he consulted spiritualists, conducting seances that thinned the veil between worlds, making the house a beacon for lost souls. When Edmund froze to death in the master bedroom in 1852, his spirit became the first permanent resident of what would become a supernatural way station. Over decades, others followed, people who died in the house nearby, or who sought it out after hearing rumors of its properties. There were the Whitmores in the 1890s, who refused to leave after their infant daughter died of scarlet fever. The Hendersons in the 1920s, honeymooners who died from carbon monoxide poisoning, their spirits still believing they were on romantic getaway. During the Depression, Mrs. Eleanor Marsh ran a boarding house where 3 tenants took their lives the same night, followed by Mrs. Marsh hanging herself from the chandelier, all 4 continuing their routines in death. Dr. Samuel Torres came in the 1940s, a war-traumatized physician whose psychological wounds resonated with the accumulated trauma of dead residents. His spirit provided medical expertise to help other troubled souls find peace. Young Margot Thorne first encountered the property in the 1960s while studying folklore at the University of Vermont. Unlike others who stumbled into the house's influence accidentally, Margot sought answers about death after her brother's death in Korea. She found more than she bargained for, not just proof of afterlife, but an entire community trapped between worlds. Margot dedicated her graduate years to studying the house and its residents, learning to communicate with the dead through methods Dr. Torres's spirit taught her. She discovered the house's supernatural properties were growing stronger each decade, fed by accumulated emotional energy of ghostly inhabitants. The silence was becoming more deliberate and powerful, containing the dead while protecting the living world. When Margot's parents died in 1962, she inherited money to purchase the house, moving in permanently as living caretaker for the dead community. She never married or had children, dedicating her life to maintaining balance between worlds. The isolation took its toll. She grew eccentric and reclusive, avoiding the living world except when necessary. For 60 years, Margot served as bridge between living and dead, helping new spirits adjust while preventing supernatural energy from spilling into the outside world. But she was only human, and eventually her body gave out. Her death disrupted the careful balance, leaving dead residents restless and desperate, their containment beginning to fail. Victoria learned this through increasingly urgent whispers. The dead weren't malevolent. They were lost, confused, desperately lonely. They'd been trapped in silent existence so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to connect with life. Victoria's presence had given them hope, a chance to remember their humanity through contact with a living person. But her departure left them more isolated than ever. They clung to the connection made with her, following through the psychic link established when she breathed the house's supernatural atmosphere. Victoria tried returning to her Boston Museum job, but voices made concentration impossible. During meetings, she heard Mrs. Marsh offering tea to invisible guests. While examining documents, Dr. Torres whispered medical observations. At night, the Henderson couple's passionate encounters played out in vivid detail in her mind. Colleagues noticed her distraction and odd behavior. Victoria responded to questions only she could hear, carried on conversations with empty air. She took longer lunch breaks, walking through historic cemeteries where whispers seemed less oppressive, as if other dead souls provided relief. After a week of sleepless nights and erratic behavior, Victoria called in sick and drove back to Burlington. She told herself she was just checking on the house, maybe arranging its sale. But as she turned onto Maple Street, she knew she was lying. The voices had guided her route, whispered directions that brought her inevitably back to 1847 Maple Street. The house looked different in afternoon light. More windows showed activity, lights flickering, curtains moving despite no wind, dark figures passing behind glass. The dead were becoming more active, more visible, using Victoria's psychic connection as conduit to manifest in the physical world. She found herself walking up the front path without conscious decision, the brass key appearing in her hand, though she didn't remember taking it from her purse. The voices spoke in unison now, welcoming her home, telling her how much they'd missed her presence, how empty the house felt without a living heart to anchor their community. The front door opened before she could use the key, familiar silence rushing out to meet her. But this time, Victoria realized she could hear things in the quiet, not with her ears, but with some other sense her exposure had awakened. She could perceive invisible footsteps, whispers of conversations existing just beyond normal perception, sounds of a community that had learned to communicate in ways the living couldn't understand. As she stepped back into the house, Victoria felt her resistance crumbling. The dead weren't her enemies. They were fellow souls trapped by circumstances beyond their control. And she was the key to their freedom, the bridge between worlds that could finally give them the connection they desperately craved. The silence welcomed her home,